Good morning. Please welcome to the stage, Carter Stewart.
Thank you. Good morning. It is so good to be here. My name is Carter Stewart. I'm with the Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation. We are one of the co-hosts, along with the Center for American Progress and John Jay. And I am privileged to welcome you back to the second day of the conference. And I also want to thank you for your flexibility yesterday. We had to have a sudden change of venue. And if you felt electricity in the air, it's because quite literally there was electricity in the air. There was an arc going back and forth between two transponders or something backstage. So thank you very much for your flexibility. Last year, when we put this on, we had over 500 advocates and activists sign up, and we had to go to a wait list. This year, we had over 700 advocates and activists sign up, and we had to go to a wait list. There is a hunger for events like this, for opportunities like this. There is a need for opportunities like this. I think Van Jones said it well last night at a wonderful event supporting incarcerated women when he said sometimes you have to have a breakdown to have a breakthrough. Sometimes you have to have a breakdown to have a breakthrough. And you would not be here in this room if you didn't think that our criminal justice system was broken. And it's folks like you who are going to help us turn this country around in that regard. Yesterday, Khalil Cumberbatch, when he was talking about the intersection between immigration justice and criminal justice, said that he would not be standing on this stage but for the advocates who supported him and who helped him get through his troubles and tribulations. Those are the advocates who are exactly like you. You are helping tens of thousands of people across this country stand on their stages and speak their truth. So I am so grateful and so thankful to be here and to be with you. We are obviously not going to solve all the problems in this conference, but the conversations that have continued here, that are starting here, they will at some point. And I dream for the day when we don't have to have conferences like this, but for now we do, and it is wonderful to see all of you. So it is my pleasure to introduce your first speaker this morning, Governor Mary Fallin. She was elected the first woman governor in Oklahoma in 2010. During her 2 terms, she signed bills to modernize and streamline government operations. She cut the income tax, increased compensation to public employees, and she also helped address the state's pension system. She has signed into law a historic lawsuit reform and also overhauled the state workers' compensation system. And she's endorsed packages from the House and Senate of Oklahoma to reform the state's criminal justice system. She has a long history of public service. Prior to serving as governor, she served 2 terms as a state representative and then became Oklahoma's first Republican and first woman lieutenant governor in 1995. After serving as lieutenant governor for 12 years, she served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2007 to 2011. Please join me in welcoming Governor Fallin.
Good morning. Let me just start out this way. And Carter, first of all, let me just say thank you for your organization and what it does to help with innovative solutions to being smart on crime. His organization helps fund some of those programs, and we appreciate that. But let me just start out this way. How many of you have never known anyone that's had a substance abuse problem that might have gotten in trouble with the justice system? Does anybody not know anybody? I got to see your hands. That's what I thought. You know, I think all of us may have had a relative, a friend, high school classmate, college classmate, or maybe even a coworker that might have had some type of addiction issue with prescription drugs, or maybe even something worse that might have ended up in the criminal justice system. But the reality is that I think all of us have known someone at one point in time in their life that have had some challenges and ended up in our criminal justice system, whether it's in a county jail or possibly even a state prison. This is an issue that's been very important to me for a long period of time, and one that I've worked on. In 1991, which was the year that I took office 20 years ago or so as a legislator, one of the things that I found out about Oklahoma and my state is that we were #1 in the nation incarcerating women. and we still are, by the way. And throughout the years that I've had the opportunity to serve, and I've worked on this issue for a long time, I've met with incarcerated people. I've met with people who have been out of prison. I have met with children who had their parents incarcerated and had a discussion with them about how did it affect their lives when a parent, or maybe even both parents, were incarcerated in prison. What are some of the challenges that they face? And of course, one of the statistics that we know is that if a child has a parent who is in prison, that they're 5 times more likely to end up in the system themselves. So that's where a lot of my interest came into this, because as a governor now, I work with foster kids, I work with children that are abused, certainly with poverty, low-income people, and just trying to help people have a better quality of life. So back in 2003, when I was lieutenant governor, I worked with a group called the Status Commission on Women to look at why we incarcerate so many women in the state of Oklahoma and some of the challenges that we had. One of the things that we found was that a large majority of the women who are incarcerated for a crime or something else may have had some type of substance abuse issue and probably were a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault in their life. So in 2011, when I became governor, I still found that things weren't changing as rapidly as they should, and then I got in a position where I could do a little bit more about it. We know right now in the state of Oklahoma that our prisons are way overcrowded. We're at about 117% capacity, which makes it dangerous for the people that work in our prisons. It also means that we're sending a large population of people in our state to prison, which means they're out of the workforce, they're not supporting their families. And once again, let me always say that anyone that's a danger to communities or to their families or to themselves and have done something need to be locked up. But those that have some type of low-level offense that is related to substance abuse or just a huge mistake, there are other ways of dealing with that, and that's what we try to do, is be smart on crime. And looking at the numbers and our statistics, the growing population that we have, we know that over the next 10 years, we're going to have to spend somewhere close to $2 billion, build 2 new prisons for men and 1 new prison for women, if we keep on this same trend of sentencing people the way we have and incarcerating them. And of course, we're not real proud of the fact that we're #1 in women, but just last year we became #1 in incarcerating men. We surpassed Louisiana, so still not good numbers. We knew that unless some type of comprehensive criminal justice reform was done in our state, that our prison population was going to actually increase about 25% over the next 10 years, which is not that far away. And of course, that costs the taxpayers billions of dollars, and it also keeps people out of the workforce and away from their families, and the children end up in foster care or some other type of care with a relative. The female population in Oklahoma is expected to grow another 60% at the rate we're incarcerating our women. Once again, a lot of them are related to substance abuse issues. So Oklahoma's journey in significant criminal justice reform started about 3 to 4 years ago, when we started really getting serious, because we just couldn't afford to keep building prisons in our state, plus it was not improving our quality of life. So we sought to find ways to keep people from going to prison in the first place, through different type of programming, to adjust some of the laws that we have on criminal justice in our state, and certainly to reduce the number of people in prison beds themselves. We, once again, want to be smart on crime. Those that are violent offenders, will certainly keep them locked up to keep people safe, but we do think there's a more effective, cost-efficient way that we can deal with our people in our criminal justice system. So we worked really hard to find the best practices that were evidence-based, metrics-driven data solutions that could help with our criminal justice growth. And so over the past 3 years, I had a task force, a criminal justice task force. We brought together anyone and everyone we could think of, whether it was victims advocates, our nonprofits, our chambers of commerce, our district attorneys, our judges, our mental health professionals, all kinds of groups that work with these types of populations. Corrections certainly has wonderful information. And we developed a comprehensive plan of data to know where we stand, how people get into the system. And we found out, one of the interesting facts is that 75% of our people sentenced in prison are non-violent offenders. It's interesting. And comparing that to other states, we found that, we sentence people, because of our numbers, to prison more than other states, and that we also didn't give people, when they came up for parole, we didn't always process them as fast, and we didn't always give them that parole. So after 7 months of studies, we came up with 27 recommendations, policy recommendations to, once again, save beds, the prison beds for serious, dangerous offenders, do something to strengthen our community supervision, do more community supervision, hopefully reduce recidivism, hold offenders accountable, and also, of course, provide better support for the victims of crimes themselves. Many of these provisions that we worked on laid the groundwork for our 2017-2018 legislative session. So over the years, we passed those things. We also had, by the way, 2 state questions that passed that the majority of Oklahomans voted to change those measures. So all these measures that I'm talking about passed in a bipartisan way. Both Republican and Democrat members supported them. So I wanted to show you a couple of things that we've done. I'll start with this slide here, which shows the things that we tried to accomplish. One is to reduce the flow of nonviolent offenders into our prison, establish more efficient, streamlined parole process, facilitate successful reentry. We've got a second slide that we will show you. And here's some of the things that we worked to accomplish. We expanded our opportunities for expungement among those convicted of no more than 1 nonviolent felony, and if they had no other previous convictions or pending charges in the last 7 years. We eliminated mandatory minimum sentences and gave judges more flexibility on sentencing for second-degree burglary and third-degree burglary. We reduced enhanced sentences for certain repeat nonviolent offenders, and we created a risk and needs assessment for those who were sentenced to prison to actually find out, is it a mental health problem, substance abuse problem, or are they just a criminal that is dangerous? Next slide, we changed the penalties for commercial drug offenses and distinguished conduct by possession with the intent to distribute and manufacture. We adjusted penalties and measures on low-level property offenses, as listed there. We created an administrative parole process for nonviolent offenders, and we gave them a case plan that they had to comply with so that the Pardon Parole Board, once again, could focus on more serious offenders. And then we established even a geriatric parole. A lot of people get really old or may have a life sentence in prison, and work towards addressing those issues. We also signed a measure that was very important to me, and I think we've had a lot of discussion around our nation about shackling pregnant women. We signed that into law this past year to give pregnant inmates more dignity in how they're treated. One, reclassified, I think I got some more slides here. We reclassified simple drug possession and low-level property crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. That was something that makes a huge difference in how many people end up in prison. We provided funding to address mental health and substance abuse issues. Slide 4, other criminal justice things that we did required offenders to receive a validated risk and needs assessment that will help guide the providers into truly the type of services they need, and mandated that corrections provide an individual case plan for every offender. Of course, training is always important for law enforcement people, especially as it relates to domestic violence cases and victim safety, especially at the pre-trial stage. We provided more training for our public defenders and certainly our district attorneys and judges. Slide 5, we gave prosecutors discretion to file charges on non-85% crimes on misdemeanors instead of felonies. We reduced the minimum mandatory punishment for drug offenders charged only with possession. We raised the threshold on property crimes from $500 to $1,000. If you stole a cell phone, you'd get a felony if it cost $500. Now it's up to $1,000. We established broader means for drug courts and certainly community sentencing. And in addition to these things, we also had to work on our budget. And so I have a slide that talks about some of the funding things that we did, because that's typically what you find as a challenge in the state is the funding. We allocated over $100,000 to put 2 more pardon parole inspectors, 2 more pardon parole board members on the board so we could speed up the parole process for those waiting for parole. We established a very innovative program called Pay for Success, with $500,000. And that basically is a program that's a public-private partnership to work with nonprofits that help with substance abuse. Slide 7, we added $4.8 million to a new offender management program that would be one statewide database so that we could track people throughout the system, and another $17 million in supplemental appropriations for correction officers, and even doing things like replacing locks, that many of them were broken in some of our prisons. And of course, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the Pay for Success. The next slide shows Women in Recovery. And this program is a very unique program that we have in Oklahoma that basically takes women who are sentenced to prison, gives them the opportunity to go into a recovery program that has education, training, helps them find a job, substance abuse, counseling to put their families together, reunification. Very successful program, very low recidivism rate, gets women back out into their communities and taking care of their families. And those are some of the innovative things we do. Slide 10, I'll tell you real quickly as I finished here. In 2012, we kept working on evidence-based risk and needs assessments for just diverting people, screening people before they go into the system. And now we have 100% of all of our felony convicted people going through this needs and risk assessment, which helps our courts and helps basically some of the inmates just stay in the county jails for maybe a year instead of ending up into our prison system. Slide 11 shows just some of the diversion on a graph that you can see that only 17% end up in prison once we go through all these screening processes. The next slide shows that we use drug courts. I think hopefully everybody uses drug courts. Had the opportunity to go to a graduation ceremony just recently. Great success rate. It costs about $5,000 to put somebody through drug court, whereas it's $19,000 to send someone to a prison system. And then lastly, one of the things we do is that we offer workforce training for our inmates. And so we teach them when they're in our prison systems. We have about 17 that we do it in, how to be a heating and air mechanic, how to be a chef. Ladies go to cosmetology school. There's some plumbing, some other things that we give them a training in. And this year we had 1,800 inmates who went through that training so that when they end up finishing their terms, hopefully they can be able to get out and be able to be more successful. There are other things that we did. My time is limited, but as you can see, there are things that you can do to be smart on crime, but also keep dangerous people that might be on the street locked up. And we're very proud of what we've been doing in Oklahoma. And I just appreciate everyone here and throughout the nation that is working on this very important topic to help us keep our families together and hopefully divert people from going to prison in the first place. Thank you so much.
The vast majority of prisoners in this country are in the state system, not in the federal system. The federal system has a minority of prisoners. Now, it's a good, the people that are going to get out, it's good. It's a good thing. It's a good first step. It's a very, very small first step. The second problem is if you listen to most politicians, when they talk about mass incarceration, they focus in on nonviolent drug dealers or nonviolent drug offenders.
Yes.
Something like 52% of our population of prisoners in our state prisons committed what we would label today some sort of violent crime.
But now, what you were saying is interesting. Is you're saying we label them as violent crimes,
right.
And we have to acknowledge that these people have committed violent crimes.
Yes.
But you're suggesting, looking, let's say, at European countries who have redefined what a life sentence is in prison. So they say 10 years is a maximum sentence.
Right.
Are these things that could ever be considered or should be considered in America? If
we do not consider them, we will not decarcerate. It's just that simple. You can't decarcerate through nonviolent drug offenders. That's a myth. I mean, you can just look at the numbers and see it. It simply is not possible without looking at it.
But then how do you respond to someone who says, why would we let a violent person go out onto the streets after he's committed that crime? Why shouldn't he stay in the entire time for the rest of his life?
Because we only decided to do this 30 years ago. This is actually a very recent development, this idea that people should be, who commit, a single violent crime or two violent, or even three violent crimes, to be honest with you, should totally lose their life. That is an actual recent development. And it's not clear that it does anything to stop crime. If you have somebody who's in their, as we do, somebody in their late 60s, for instance, why are we still holding them in prison? What's the argument for that? They did something violent when they were in their 20s. What crime-stopping policy is actually authorizing that?
Because now, basically, at that age, studies have shown repeatedly that you basically passed the age of crime. You've reached a level where you're no longer a threat to society, and yet we keep these people locked up.
Right. My colleague Jeff Goldberg likes the phrase criminal menopause. And that's basically what's happened. I mean, most crimes are committed during a certain age. And so, but this is not even a conversation that politicians are ready to have. I mean, it's just too radioactive right now. But without having it, you will not decarcerate. And anybody who tells you that you can is lying. Anybody who says you can do this through nonviolent drug offenders is just not being serious.
So drug offenders is the first step, but it is by no means the answer to the problem.
Not even close.
Please welcome Jeremy Travis, Erica Ford, Mai Fernandez, and Danielle Sered.
Morning, everyone. How you all doing? Good. So it's wonderful for me to be here. I have a connection to this college, and it's nice to see that it's in good hands with Carol at the lead, and it continues to do the work that's so important on behalf of the criminal justice reform ideas around the country, and that this conference might become an annual event is just thrilling, really, I think, for all of us. So congratulations to the organizers, to President Mason, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Lauren John Arnold Foundation, we're delighted to join with other funders that are making this possible. And so far, so good. It's been a great first day, and today looks like it's going to be equally exciting. So it's very good to be here, and good to come home for me to John Jay. We have a placeholder in your program called A Conversation About Violence. And we have with us 3 individuals, and we're hoping for the 4th. He has a flight challenge at the moment. I don't know where he is between here and LaGuardia, but we hope that he comes soon to join us. And we have really a terrific panel that we've put together to talk about violence. And we'll do some introductions in a second and get the conversation started. But I think it's noteworthy that we have a conversation about violence in this conference. And Ed Chung started us off yesterday by saying, we can't continue to do the reform work without having an honest conversation about how we respond to violence, and sort of left hanging, what does it mean to respond to violence? And the related question, why? Why do we have to do this work? So we have a good panel. We're going to set aside some time for Q&A afterwards. So now I'll believe I'm in a class. Students, pay attention and listen and think about what you would like to ask our panel before we take a break. So we'll get started. Let me do some introductions. It's all in your program, but some of these people you know already. But we have from right to left. Right, you're right to left. Danielle Sered, who's the president of the Common Justice Foundation entity. You don't call yourself Common Justice. That's it, right? And which is incubated by the Vera Institute of Justice. So she has become, in a short time, a very important national voice for this topic, and a distinctive, unique voice, and I give her a lot of credit for really being out there, helping us grapple with some difficult issues. Her organization is a diversion restorative justice program, but it's become something much larger than that in the national discussion, the discussion we're having today. So, and I'll, without her permission, give you a plug for her book that is coming out in March. Is that okay? Yeah. I mean, you don't want to sell it, right? More importantly, she wants people to read it. And to her left, to her right, I can't do these directions very well here, is Mai Fernandez. Mai is the director of the National Center for Victims of Crime, a Washington-based organization that is the national voice on behalf of victims. And you remember that yesterday when Carol Bogert from the Marshall Project talked about her poll of her colleagues as to what perspective is missing in the national conversation, and they all came to one conclusion, which is the voice of victims. And for those of you who have done political work, and are thinking about Proposition 47 in particular, the decision to organize survivors as part of that reform movement just shows that the victim's voice can be very powerful. And her organization in Washington they are the national voice for victims. So it's great to have her on this panel. And we need to have, of course, Erica Ford, because Erica brings something distinctive, powerful, unique to any conversation about violence. Erica is known, particularly here in New York, but increasingly nationally, looking at violence from a community perspective and looking at the trauma experienced by communities, by the operations of the justice system as a form of violence. I don't know if that you would put it exactly that way, but I think you probably would. And so this perspective, this bottom-up perspective, is also very important. So just join me in welcoming this really spectacular panel that we have here today. So we're going to start this way. If we were, with no disrespect to our journalist friends, but if we were sort of looking at this question as a question of national picture, we would start with, and it just came out, so this is a good time to do this. What does the Uniform Crime Report have to say about violence? This would be the way we would sort of, in a sense, anesthetize ourselves to the realities of violence. We say it's up, it's down. Last year, there were 18 cities that had an increase in homicide, 15 cities that had a decrease. Overall, it was 2% down to 3%. I get lost in all this stuff. We celebrate the fact that it's the lowest it's ever been, and it's come down a lot since 1991, and isn't this good? It's not. And the realities of violence on the ground, and certainly realities of American violence compared to any other Western democracy, are, I think, a stain on the conscience of the country. So the question is, if we get beyond the national numbers and the national trends, they're not unimportant, but they don't really get to where we want to be, we come frontally into a I think, a pretty deep national conversation about what do we do about the very high levels of violence, particularly concentrated in a small number of communities, particularly disproportionately affecting communities of color, and community violence, not to forget the important phenomenon of intimate partner violence, not to forget the shootings that happen in this country with stunning regularity. A little shout out to my foundation that just made a $20 million commitment to promote research on gun violence so that we can try to find a way to develop policies that will save lives. So here we are with this national phenomenon that we need to talk about, have a difficult time talking about, and we have three people who know how to talk about it. So the first question I'm going to ask the panel, I'll start with Danielle, is why? Channel Ed Chung. So Ed had something on his mind. Maybe we get it right, maybe we don't get it right, but he said we had to talk about violence as part of this Smart on Crime national conversation. Why? Why do we have to?
So thank you. It's a delight to be here with you. Good morning, you all. I think there are two main reasons we have to take on the question of violence, those of us who are committed to ending mass incarceration. And the first is just numerical. Like, more than half of people incarcerated in state prisons are incarcerated for crimes of violence, which means if we aspire to reducing mass incarceration dramatically by more than half, it means we cannot ignore people who have committed violence. And I want to note, too, that saying reducing incarceration by more than half may sound ambitious, and fundamentally, in many ways, is not. The day I was born, there were 443,850 people locked up in America. I shared that once with Todd Clear, and he guessed my birth month. If you're someone who knows that kind of data, keep it to yourself. That's your special personal gift. So if we think about reducing incarceration by half, we're still conceding a threefold increase in my lifetime, right? Which, despite the opinions of the adolescents I work with day in and day out, is not actually that long. And so there is no way to get to levels that we have known, that we have lived through, that we have seen without tackling violence. So it's just numerical. But the other reason is more profound. We don't build prisons because we want to incarcerate people for petty crimes or even for drug crimes. That's not to say prisons aren't filled with people who have been convicted of those crimes. What we build them for is a story. Like, we build them based on stories of fear. We give up our hospitals and our schools and our roads and our infrastructure and our community resources. We give up all those things not just for some punitiveness, but for some idea of protection. And we do that because we have long been told a story about some imagined monstrous other, right? Someone is so fundamentally different from us that they don't quite feel pain the way that we do, and they're capable of inflicting pain in a way we never could. That story in this country is old, and it is highly racialized. It is the fundamental myth at the heart of structural racism, that story of an imagined monstrous other. And if we don't come for that story, if we don't steer into it, if we don't confront the legacy of racism in this country and what we have been taught to believe, then we don't stand a chance not only at addressing incarceration as it relates to violence, but of ending mass incarceration as a whole.
Thank you. Mai, same question. Why do we have to? What's the urgency? What's the framing of a discussion about violence in this era of justice reform?
Thanks, Jeremy, and thank you all for being here. So to go with Danielle's story of the monster, I've got an 8-year-old boy. I started late, and he was in the back of the car 2 days ago, and 2 boys were being arrested around the corner from our house. And when he saw that, like any 8-year-old boy, he was like, "Oh my gosh, Mommy, did you see that? Did you see what they were wearing? And they had hoodies on." And you know, when I grow up and I'm president, I am going to put a SWAT team, the police, and I think the Army at the corner of our house. And I was like, whoa. And I said, and all bad people will go to jail. And I was like, okay. And I started going through in my head, like, okay, do I talk to him about how the system doesn't work or about the need to be trauma informed? And I was like, no, be a mom. And I said, you don't want that, honey, because people who go to jail come out worse. And he was like, oh, for about a second, and then he went on to wanting a police truck and everything else outside of our house. But it is what victims want is different in every case, but has a fundamental seed. They don't want that violence to happen to them again. And they don't want it to happen to their loved ones. So if we've got a system that is broken and doesn't work, why would victims want that? If kids come out worse, if adults come out worse, then this is not a solution for victims either. And so I think that's at the root of talking about violence. There is violence in our country. It's hugely damaging to populations. And we need to be able to find something that works and keeps people safe and lets them enjoy their communities. So I think that's at the root of, we need to talk about violence because we need to come up with a solution that's just not this primal feeling of an 8-year-old of, if we put all these trucks and police cars and everything around us and we stick everybody in jail, we're all gonna be safer. We're not. So let's try to think this over again.
Thank you. Erica, same question. Why is this conversation important, timely, and relevant to the larger conversations?
I would beg to say, what is violence? And I would beg to say what is violence because as Black and brown people, we live in a violent society. We live in a society that makes sure that our education system to our children is inadequate, that the housings that we live in is inadequate, and that the police terror that we live under continues to traumatize and terrorize us and put us in a place of fear. We live in a society where people look at us as animals and objects and afterthoughts. And so, to me, the violence that the American government creates a society of people who live in fear and then therefore builds a prison industrial system that profitize violence. And so it's not about fear, it's not about the things that I disagree with what folks said. It is a prison industrial complex that is based on dollars and cents. When you say that your foundation is getting ready to put $20 million in research, when we know if we put $20 million in the streets in Black and brown communities, that it will make a fundamental difference as opposed to studying what we need to study, to be more studied about study. You know, I think that the issue in our community is that if you look at the conversation that has happened within the last day and probably is going to happen today, that black men are absent from the conversation. And when you look at the number of people who are killed in our streets, the number of people who are incarcerated, it is black men. And black men need to lead the conversation. Black men need to be invested in. And we have the answer. We don't need people to come into our community and tell us what is going to be the response. Most of the foundations, all of the foundations in here, I would probably say 1%, if any, funds the work that I do, right? And so I know that my work is successful. I know that the foundations that are in this room that say that they are dedicated to eradicating violence and changing mass incarceration don't go to the streets. And to me, that is violent, because this room is the answer, quote unquote. But yet we don't want the answer. We shy away from those who know that they can resolve their fundamental problems in their community. And we go fund some people who look cute. And we go fund some people who are talking some smoke and mirror smoke talk, so because it'll make us look good and give us some data and numbers and make us feel pretty. But eradicating violence is going at the face of oppression. Eradicating the conditions that give life to a young man who will say that about people that are being arrested. Eradicate the mindset that would say to the person who is leading, as you said, the conversation on violence in America, that the question of the prison system is racism based on fear and not the economics of imprisoning black and brown people. And so if this is the leadership of the conversation, then we're in trouble.
So, Erica, can I stick with you a second?
You could stick with me for the next 33 seconds.
So, as we had the discussion about what we wanted to communicate, it was, you heard the opening statements. We also wanted to shift a bit, and I'll start with Erica, as to, so what are you seeing or working with, and you talked about the work that you're doing here in New York, that you think is on the ground, that is making a difference, and how would you frame that work in terms of this larger national discussion?
And it's more than on the ground, right? The ground has to interconnect with the researchers, with the victims, with everyone that plays a role in this process. And so in New York, we have something that is called the New York City Crisis Management System. It is 23 sites, over 60 organizations, and over 10 city agencies that work together to co-produce public safety. And although the Cure Violence model is at the base of the operation, it is only at the base of the operation because they said the only way we could be funded is if we use the evidence-based model, Cure Violence, right? And so I said Cure Violence is not enough, and that we have to look at it.
For people that might not know what Cure Violence is, just take a second.
They can Google it.
Yeah. If it's helpful.
That we had to address it as a public health issue, that we had to look at the trauma that is being impacted in our community. We had to look at the miseducation. We had to look at the inequalities of the legal system for black and brown people. And so in this system, we provide free legal services. We are in the schools. We are interrupting in the streets. We are working with the victims to help them move from a place of they don't want to live anymore, or they want to take revenge, to the place of healing. And so, although I can't give this, that fast, but it is a holistic approach that addresses every facet of what we do and how we live. And so if we're not in a comprehensive model, then, and all of us working together, and it started at 5 sites in New York City with $5 million, and now, as I said, it's 23 sites and $36 million. And so it is important to invest in what you say you want to eradicate. And we have to invest in the streets, in the community. When I say the streets, I'm not saying give money to a mom and pop organization. I'm saying that we have to change mindsets. We have to change the mindset of the people writing the laws, of the people breaking the laws, of the people enforcing the laws, of the people enforcing the incarceration and people in the school system. Everybody's mindset has to change because the way we think is not working for us. It is not.
Mai, next to you. So just give us a bit of a sense of what the National Center is up to and what you're seeing with your national perspective and with your victim-centered perspective that you think is effective, noteworthy, cutting edge, worthy of discussion.
So I started my job about 9 years ago, and I came from a mom and pop shop in the community, and where we were trying to invest in the kinds of things that Erica is talking about. And one of the things that was, I didn't even think that it was an issue, was that my kids were both offenders one day and victims the next. It was strictly a label that the criminal justice system put on them, but it was not anything that they thought was of any importance. When I came into this position, the field, the victims field, which again was sort of a word out there that is propagated, was like, well, there's victims and then there's offenders. And I'm like, no. There's a person who has one day committed a crime and the next day has been the victim of a crime. What I've seen over the last probably 9 years has been that the field, and I think it's because we've made the circle bigger of the people we're talking about, is that understanding that you cannot deal with a person just as an offender or as a victim, but as an entire person that is complex, and you need sophisticated responses to that individual. You can't make just black and white decisions. So, and I'm kind of fearful to say this because I think Erica might come at me, but the Justice Policy Institute, which is a partner organization of ours, they work on criminal justice issues, and they came to us probably about 1.5 years ago and said, you know, we want to look at the issue of violent crime and how to serve young people better who have been charged with violent crimes, and how would the victim community even be willing to have a conversation? And I said, well, let's see if they're willing to have a conversation. We did. So we put together a roundtable of victim organizations around the country. And we said, how about serving young people who have been charged with violent crimes in the community rather than in prisons and jails, in juvenile detention institutions? And interestingly, what was definitively said is, we don't have a complete bar with thinking about serving these kids in the community. Because just because they've been charged with a violent crime doesn't necessarily mean that they're at risk of committing another violent crime. We've got to look at these kids as kids. Anybody who's got a kid out there, which, hands up, who's had a kid that's done something stupid? Okay, that's the other thing I told my kid. I said, you know, make sure you don't do something like that. And he goes, why would I do something like that? And I said, because kids do stupid things. And he goes, are you telling me I'm stupid? And I'm like, okay, again, we're not going to get into that. But there was an openness to hearing about that. The things that they were concerned with were accountability. We want to make sure that the kid is held accountable, but that doesn't mean putting them in jail. We want to make sure that we're looking at all the needs of the young person, but we're also looking at all the needs of the victims and how we meet that. And then how do we resource our community-based organizations? The mom and pop shops that were brought up, you know, we always say, oh, community-based organizations, we're gonna put this kid in the community. Well, those organizations barely make payroll. And now we're asking them to take on violent kids. Again, we don't know if they're violent kids. They've been charged with a violent crime. So that was what the first roundtable that we did, and then we did a study. And what we found out was it was possible that there are states out there that are serving young people in the community that have been charged with violent crimes, and the kids are doing better. Again, something we probably don't need to study. Kids in an awful situation are going to come out more awful. Kids in a nurturing situation are going to come out better. We probably didn't need to study that, but we did, and guess what we found?
I just need to rise to the defense of studies. You know, studies can change the world, right? We'll continue this. There's a long history here. Danielle, if you would, and you can talk about other things too, but your organization, in one of the many ways I think it's been pioneering, Common Justice, has tried to take on the very hard case of diverting from the traditional system of punishment people, most of them young men, charged with and sometimes convicted of crimes of violence. Often diversion is with the low-hanging fruit, the easy cases. You went right for the hard ones. So reflect on that organizational experience and how it was working with the DA's office. Any press here so we can talk about your DA's office friends? And the experience of working with the individuals who had been charged and those whom they had harmed. What did you learn from that?
Let me be brief. So Common Justice operates an alternative to incarceration and victim service program based in restorative justice practices. We work with 16 to 26-year-olds who commit serious robberies and assaults, crimes involving serious injury, involving weapons, involving very serious harm. And with those, they hurt. In cases where the victims consent, those cases are diverted into restorative justice process where we prepare people separately, convene a dialogue where they reach agreements about what the responsible person can do to make things as right as possible. And over the next year, the responsible person completes those agreements, goes through an intensive violence intervention curriculum, and at the same time, we provide wraparound services to the people who are hurt. I think one of the most important things we've learned in our work is that, I said we only take cases if the victims of crime agree. Fewer than half of victims call the police in the first place. So if we want one fact that tunes us into the total failure of our criminal justice system and its indifference to human suffering and pain, the fact that half of people prefer nothing to everything that system has on offer should shake us to our moral core. Another half of those who call the police don't make it past grand jury, so they call the police in the moment and then they divest from the process before it even gets there. That remaining quarter are arguably the jailingest subset of victims you'll find, right? They're people who are proceeding through a process that they know is likely to produce the incarceration of the person who hurt them. And we ask those people, would you rather the person who hurt you be incarcerated, or would you rather they come to Common Justice? 90% choose Common Justice. 90%. It's a wild number. And when I first saw that number, I started to think, oh, humans are better than I thought we were, right? We're more compassionate, we're more generous, we're more gracious, we believe, but for the grace of God go I, all of that. And that's true probably in some of those cases. But in most of the cases, what's happening is something that I, as a survivor myself, should have known, which is that we survivors are pragmatic. We feel like fear, where we will shake and tremble in our own homes, in the place where we are safest, in the arms of the people with whom we feel safest, because the fear is so deeply rooted in us. And we'll feel sorrow that makes us want to wring out our bones in case that's where it's stored in our bodies, just to be free of it. And we'll feel rage that makes us unrecognizable even to ourselves. And the one thing that will outrank all of that is our pragmatism. We want to be safe, and we want others to be safe. We can't endure the thought of going through what we went through again, and we can't abide the thought of someone else experiencing what we did. In the late 80s and early 90s, when I came of age in Chicago at a time when the levels of violence there were a lot like what they are now, when I buried people when I was way too young to bury people who were way too young to die, mass incarceration was a hypothesis, right? It sort of seemed like we knew most of the people among us, like we were caring for each other, and we were lifting each other up, and we were caring for each other's kids, and we were living in really righteous community, and there were a few people among us who were causing harm, and the hypothesis hypothesis that if you removed those people, then the dominant ways we were with each other would characterize our neighborhoods made some sense. It was compelling as a hypothesis. It was wrong. Like, it missed the fact that structural factors produce violence, right? It missed the things that Erica is bringing into the room about the economic structures, the historical structures, not just poverty, but inequity, right? That all of those things that make violence inevitable, that it was never any one person or group of people's innate evil. It was a set of structures that made violence inevitable in our neighborhoods, so that when we removed those people, all we did was tear families apart, as every person we removed was someone's brother or someone's father or someone's child or someone's aunt. And that disruption tore at the fiber of the community that was the one thing holding us together in the face of the onslaught of violence, of structural violence, of 500 years of white supremacy, right? Like, all of those things, that the things that were nurturing communities, even in the presence of those factors, were disrupted by the removal of people, even people who committed harm. Because even people who commit violence, the vast majority of the time, they're not committing violence. Right? They're loving people, they're saying foolish things, they're caring for their families, they're working the jobs they have. Like, and all those things are removed when we remove them from their communities. And so what's happening now, the reason 90% of survivors say yes, is the hardest people to persuade that incarceration works is anyone who has lived in a neighborhood where incarceration is common. If you try and if you have a theoretical conversation with someone who hasn't seen its failure, hasn't paid the price with their own life, with their own safety, with their own loss of love and loved ones, they might believe you that it's a great idea. But in this country, we have come to a point where there are far too many of us who know that this solution is trash, that the experiment has failed, that we should have known going into it that it would fail, because everything we know about what drives violence, the core drivers of violence on an individual, not structural level, are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. The 4 core features of prison: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. We have baked into our responses to violence exactly the things that drive them. That's not what a country that wants to end violence does. And so what has to happen first, and this speaks to what Erica's bringing in the room that I appreciate your sort of artful invitation to us to dodge, but I will not accept the invitation, is that unless we get at the thing in us as America, and as white America in particular, that drives us to develop solutions that have baked into them exactly the things that generate those problems, the part of us that either thinks we're being honest, which means we have bought a very long set of lies, or knows we're being dishonest, which means we are acting with depraved indifference, until we get at that, like, however many solutions, like, we have a less than 6% failure rate for people in our program. We've had one person terminated for a new crime in nearly 7 years. We will not thrive, and we will not grow as an organization until collectively we come at those underlying structural questions.
Now you're getting a flavor of why you need to buy the book. So let's just have a little bit of political talk among friends. What's hard about this? You dealt with city council, you dealt with the mayor's office, you dealt with sort of institutional forces that were in place and moved a big mountain in the work that you've done here in our city. You're facing similar issues in terms of changing the system, right? To think differently. Maya, you do this work at a national level. So just be advisors to those who want to say, okay, I'm ready to take on some big challenges, and help us think about what's the blockage. I'm going to start with Maya on this one. Just what's the how do you name the obstacles? We sort of named it in a big sense, but what are you seeing from your national perspective about what are the politics of getting this perspective through such that it is making a difference in communities and in the way this larger sort of ecosystem thinks about violence? What's the hardest thing?
Well, I think it's what my colleagues have said, and said it more articulately than I have, which is it's an us and them. You want to think that somehow you are you can do something for the people committing violence and it's going to stop. But there is a lack of true understanding, as Danielle said beautifully, as to what's going on in those communities. And again, those communities, like I said, will understand, like, they won't even have the conversation that somebody is not a victim or an offender, that all of that lies within your family or inside of your community. But people want to talk about this like it is a research problem, like it's, you know, it's out there and we're going to figure out how to fix it. I think a lot of it, it's about putting on somebody else's shoes and walking in those communities and really understanding those communities. And then having them help create a solution also. So sometimes I do think that, you know, could we have taken, you know, we got $500,000 from a program from the federal government. Would it have been better to give that $500,000 to the community and have them figure out what to do with it? Possibly. I don't know. I don't know if simple solutions never work. But this stuff it's sophisticated, it's nuanced. So you've got to get in there and figure out how we create a criminal justice that doesn't just create these binary decisions. You're good, you're bad, you go to jail, you don't. But it's looking at the individual, looking at that individual's needs, both from when they're a victim and they're offender, and creating solutions that aren't this or that. And that takes a lot of time, and creating a system. We do it maybe poorly in our medical systems. We don't go in and say, you've got cancer, you need one kind of treatment. We create a treatment package for that person. Well, I think the criminal justice system has to do that too, for both victims and offenders, and understanding that they can be combined.
The crisis management system that you've pioneered here in New York is, the way you just described it, has become a serious sort of presence in our city. But there was a time when that didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And you and others convinced the city to embrace that. So what was the winning argument? How did you get through?
We took around 10,000 people in 5 caskets to their doorsteps and said, you know, you got to do this. It was the activism that made people. It was the consistency of organizing and being at their feet and their doorsteps and organizing people to vote, that after 10 years of organizing and working, that they even listened to the conversation. And so it wasn't a magic thing. It was hard work. And also, I would say that one of the things in the political world is you don't know what you don't know. And so a lot of the things that I talk about is fairly you don't know. And you will never know because you're not of and in and experiencing what other people are experiencing. And you have to be okay with that. And you have to be okay with saying, I don't know. And I have trust in this individual and this individual because they know, they live it, they experience it. They've went through it. And so I'm going to sit and listen to them. And I'm going to invest in what they're talking about. And it might not be cute and it might not be sexy, but it will work. It will work. Because as y'all say y'all have these different quotes and things, the people closest to the problem or the closest to the solution, and the people who have been the victims can come back and be the healers. And, you know, but do you really believe it? You know, and is it more than a job? Because this is our life. I live in South Jamaica, Queens. I grew up in South Jamaica, Queens. I went to over 75 funerals before I was 25 years old. And so it's real. It's real seeing children with empty faces because their parents are dead or in jail. And we have the answer. Throughout New York City, in those 23 sites, all of those organizations, like Danielle is talking about, we have the answer, and we don't do it in silos. We work together. And if you invest in togetherness, if you break the fear, if you believe in what you don't know that somebody else knows, and that someone who doesn't look like you can, yes, lead you, and has the authority and the expertise on their life and the life of their children, you get a politician that gets elected and put in office, that don't make them the know with, that just makes somebody have a job that is the politician in that community, just like the basketball player, just like the sanitation person, just like the president of the college. Everybody's got different jobs. This is not our job, this is our life. These are our children. That politician is gonna go in that job and out that job. These people live in these communities. These people bury these people every day. They live in gunshots every day. 18-year-old got killed 3 blocks from my house last night. My team went out there last night and is here this morning and has to go back and work with that family and help that parent, as Ms. Dixon, who sits there, whose son died in her hands. And then we hired her to do this work. It's not about researching anything anymore except researching how we can continue to invest in people that are doing things that work. It is a disrespect for people who are committed to this work not to have a conversation with me and my peers. When we are the experts in this arena and we have something that has made New York City the safest big city in America. And so, I'm speaking for Danielle, because she's going to say the same thing I'm saying, except a little extra, you know, because the work that Common Justice does is no different than the work that we do. You know, and the common justice is for y'all to understand that justice is not a vacuum. Justice is not absent of the people who need the justice. You know, and oppression is real. Racism is real. It is real. You walk by us like we don't even exist.
We have a couple minutes left. We're going to open it up to Q&A, so please get your questions ready. So here's what I'd like to do in the last few minutes, starting with you, Danielle, if you could. So we have elected officials in the room, we have government officials in the room, we have individuals who are trying to think how to sort of incorporate this, you know, very rich and very challenging conversation into their day jobs when they go back to whatever they're doing. You know, in different ways, we're here privileged not having to do that work on behalf of government, because that's tough work. So what would you like them to do differently, having heard this panel? No, seriously, what should they actually incorporate into their work thinking, what they do, you know, irrespective of what agency, they're public servants, they work for us. And what should they do differently? And then we'll wrap it up and get some questions. Yeah.
So I would say 2 things. The first is really echoing what Erica said about trusting where the expertise lies. If you read everything about drivers of violence, there is no explanation for why communities of color have survived in America, right? The levels of violence, the concrete physical violence, structural violence that communities have endured is almost unimaginable to anyone who hasn't experienced it, and almost unendurable to people who have. So the fact that communities continue to persist and thrive means that the kind of modalities to produce safety, the kind of healing modalities that live in those communities have to be, pardon my language, the best shit there's ever been, right? And so like Healing Works, which is a national field and movement building project that we operate, that it works to ensure that survivors of color have the collective power and capacity to ensure healing equity, and that systems and structures act in the interest of every community's inherent right to heal, knows where that expertise lies, and thinks a lot about structures for moving money. So for government officials, sometimes that means like you make a grant to someone like me who will sub-grant it to a community organization, where you're like, this community organization cannot make it through the kind of paperwork and bureaucratic rigor that is required to get city and state and federal money. And so you find an intermediary who has the infrastructure and will move that money for you. Like, you think of creative structures. I think the Safe in the City grants in New York City are a beacon of what investment can look like. They are moving money to, like, in grants of sometimes as small as $100 or $200 to people in communities who are part of co-producing safety. It's extraordinary. And then the one other thing I would say, and then I'm going to be very quick because I see Jeremy, even though I'm trying to block
You're
him
trying
out.
not to, I know.
I'm going to look at you over here on this side of the room. I'm going to say something that's will be strange to those of you who've known me for a long time, which is I'm going to defend prosecutors. And what I mean by that is that we cannot expect our elected officials to stand out ahead of where constituencies are. There are all these new progressive prosecutors being elected across the country. My bet is that the biggest predictor of which of those prosecutors will produce really transformative change is what constituencies those DAs answer to. So there are some who are elected by the same people who have been voting for a long time that didn't do real organizing and base building work, but sort of caught up with the fact that their predecessor was a little out of sync and beat them on something or some corruption or something. And then there are prosecutors who are there because people have organized and who are answerable to the communities where violence and incarceration are most common. For people who are elected,
Thank you, Danielle.
be answerable. Thank you, Jeremy.
Great. You did it. You got it in there, right? You got it in there. My folks who work on our behalf for government have to figure out what are they going to do differently when they go back after this conference? What should they do differently?
So this audience has got intelligence, it's got political savvy, it's got money. All things that the community often don't have at the level that you need to make real change. So you need to, if you can combine grassroots with, the intellect and bring those two together and respect both. One needs to respect the both. They both come at it, one went to Harvard, one didn't, but it doesn't mean they don't come from a basis of real knowledge. So how do you create ways that those people can partner together? Erica learned how to speak truth to power, but I guarantee not everybody in her community knows how to do that. Many of you in this room know how to speak truth to power and can train people in the community. Many of you have the kinds of things, and I've always thought an intermediary for funding is a great thing because, you go to a community group and you say, what's your overhead? And they're gonna look at you like, what do you mean my overhead? The clouds? I mean, no. You need somebody who understands how to do books and how to keep track of finances and all of that. But again, that's a partnership. There is intellectual power at the grassroots, there's intellectual power at higher levels, and resources. You need to bring those two things together. So what I would do is challenge foundations and governments into figuring out how to put those two things together for real change.
What do they do differently?
Take 10% of their budget and put it into the streets, into people doing grassroots, boots on the ground work. They should all contact me. You should not. Erica Ford at peaceisalifestyle.com. Make sure you write it down, and you should contact me because I only have 1 minute and 20 seconds, so that's not enough time to tell you what to do. So you definitely need to contact me and set up a meeting, and I can bring my colleagues, and we could talk about the success of the New York City crisis management system and how we can grow that concept.
Great. Thank you. Please thank this panel for a wonderful discussion. We have some time for some questions, so here's the trick. If you want to ask a question, raise your hand, and I'll call upon somebody with a microphone either in this aisle or that aisle as soon as I see somebody with a hand up. Right? And two hands. You get the first question. So here's the deal.
Over here.
Just identify yourself, please, your organization. A question, not a long statement, and if it addressed to somebody, please say who that person would be.
And do I get back that time you just used? But anyway, I'm Judge Bernice Donald with the U.S. Courts, and I am also active in the American Bar Association's Criminal Justice Section. Dr. Kerry Ressler at Harvard did some studies talking about the issues of people who live and exist day in, day out in high density, high poverty, high violent communities. And he talked about the prolonged impact of living in that situation and its impact on the brain, and he brings in neuroscience. It seems like some of the things we've been talking about right now deal with symptoms, not going back to root cause. And it seems to me that there needs to be some intervention on how we transform, improve the toxicity of many communities in which people are growing, living, and thriving that get us to some of the issues we've been talking about up there. And I wondered about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Let's do one person to take that on. Who wants to go
So the
for
New
it?
York City Crisis Management System does that. It deals with changing, the Cure Violence model does it as well, changing community norms, helping the community deal with the trauma that is historic trauma, and so it is part of what we do in terms of transforming. And it is necessary. It's mostly not invested in most of the research that these folks have researched. They'd missed that one.
So there's another up there? Yes, please, and identify yourself. And are you addressing a question to somebody?
Hi, so my name is Sophie Halter from the Doe Fund, and I guess my question is for Maya and probably Erica. So I'm going to pose a kind of broad question. One of my favorite quotes by Cornel West is, "Justice is what love looks like in public." And I think for many people in this room, we really want to know how to combine the grassroots with government work and to make a partnership that's genuine and that can affect change. So in your view, if someone approaches you and says, my community has been experiencing violence and wants to address some of these issues, what do you think, what would you tell them? What would be the kind of initial steps on kind of addressing that and helping them to start making change in their community? What would be your advice to them?
Okay. You nominated Mai or Erica. Mai, you want to take that?
So I think when you said the community comes to you, I think you need to figure out who your community is, and so bring the people who are concerned or have voiced their concern together to really assess what they're seeing and doing. And then I think you have to bring all the powers that can make change in that community and start creating that relationship. I mean, people talk about partnerships, they talk about strategies, it's about relationship. And those community members need to know that they have access and very clean pathways to access for whatever they need to change around their situation. And again, there can be somebody that says, we need a needs assessment, we need to do a gap analysis, all of those things. But I think once you start creating those relationships and clear pathways to resources, some of that can be, you put a label on what you need, a strategy, a gap analysis or whatever, but what you need is to start with, we have people who are willing to help us climb out of a really bad situation. They're willing to help us, and they're willing to be with us in the trench and then pull us out.
Is there another? Yes, over there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for such an excellent panel. I'm Nikichi Taifa with the Open Society Foundations, and I convened the Justice Roundtable. So several years ago, we heard from Cory Booker, who talked about the issue of violence, to a thunderous applause in a very bipartisan audience. John Legend talks about it. We just saw Ta-Nehisi Coates on the film. I guess my question is, how do we move from the rhetoric, which is very widely and positively received, to the reality of William Underwood, who's 64 years old, spent over 30 years in prison, a drug crime, loving father, grandfather, Michelle West, in prison as a result of conspiracy, all with some undertones of violence, because you can't deal with the drug issue unless there's some violence somewhere upstream. How do we move from the rhetoric to the very, very real cases of people who are basically serving virtual death sentences in prison?
Thank you, Nkechi. Do you want to try that, Danielle? And
Sure.
this may be the last question. Or anyone else wants to jump in too?
One of my beloved mentors and colleagues says, you don't win because you're right, you win because you're strong. And I think there are times we think that the pathway is through persuasion, and we're deep believers in culture change work. Like, you're gonna see a video with Mrs. Jackson. It will say Susan's story. I have known her for a decade. I have never called her that name. I call her Mrs. Jackson. Where we do communications and work to change hearts and minds and all of that. I think that work is very important. The thing I think that actually translates that kind of shift into action is power. And so it's about organizing, understanding the difference between organizing and advocacy. So it's not just a handful of people who go to state capitals, but it's really building a base of people whose lives are at stake at the outcome, in the outcome of what will happen, people who are willing to be accountable to people whose lives are at stake in the outcome and fight alongside them, and to build that kind of power. And I think persuasion is important. It's valuable. We've accomplished, all of us in this room have accomplished things through persuasion of people in positions to pull a lever, open a door, do all those things. But ultimately, I think we win because we're strong.
Anyone else wants to take on Nkeshi's question about how to move on behalf of particularly people who are incarcerated? What's the pathway?
I think that is big business. Like, people are getting paid. They invest, a lot of these big organizations will give more money to people to do a conference, or not, no disrespect to the conference, right? But, to do these kind of big talking stuff, right? As opposed to work in the streets. And so we have to shift what we're funding. Like, there's funders in here, there's people in here that put money into the community or define where money. We have to shift our work to the resolution of the problem as opposed to the discussion about the problem. I think we talked out. We could look at old videos and read old research papers and, have enough stuff and use this Google Docs. We could go on Zoom and all come together. And let's put the money into the streets, into the work, into the people who are going into these prisons and helping change mindsets, helping to keep people out of prison, helping to stop these people of violence. You got to look at where the violence is coming from. And then you go and you deal with the violence face on. And so you look at investing, for the person who asked the last question, you deal with putting resources to stop the violence and putting resources to help people heal from the violence that has been happening over and over. And so some of those resources are money, some of it is labor, some of it is different kind of things, little and big. And so we have to invest where the problem is and stop researching and talking about it, and let's get to it.
Mai, you get the final word, and then we'll wrap it up.
Me?
No. Mai gets the final word.
Oh, wow.
Nkechi asked everybody to come up with an answer. So if you don't want to,
You
take the final
minute.
minute.
The prep. You made me start. Now you're going to make me finish after that. Look, I echo what has been said from my colleagues on this panel. I mean, if you don't start investing at the grassroots level, and if not, quite honestly, we are living off the backs of poor people by just examining and thinking and studying. We need to invest in communities where poverty is directly, and again, taking all of the resources that you have here, all the intellectual power, but taking it where it needs to go. We don't need to live in our ivory towers. We don't need to speak in our beautiful phrases. We need for once and for all, to take it where the problem is and solve it.
That's the final word. Please join me in thanking this great panel and all of you. A wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, guys.
Came home, and as we're coming out the door, Kenneth is coming out. He's going to the park to play basketball. 6, 7 o'clock. He still hadn't gotten home yet. But his dad had just went out, said that he saw him at the store. He said he'd be home in a little while. The little while never came. The guy came into the store, and Kenneth and his 2 friends was sitting outside on the car. The way he was looking at them was kind of strange. He thought they were dissing him. They wasn't even thinking about it. They wasn't even talking to him. Pulled the gun out of his waistband. As Kenneth went to grab for the gun, the guy grabbed him, shot him at point blank range. There was no way that he could have survived. Kenneth hung out with a lot of young men in the neighborhood. I'm going to say anywhere from 20 young men came and circled my house. One of his friends, he had been locked up for about 15, 20 years. He said, "Mama, Pop, I did time. But for Kenneth, I'll do some more time. You just give me the okay, and I will get the job done." And we said, no. People were willing to do whatever it took. What would revenge do? What are the ramifications that's going to come out? Is it to tear the family apart even more? Or realize that it's more important to keep the family together? Because if we don't, it just perpetuates and perpetuates. No one heals. What could have, should have, would have been. I'm not tormented by that. You have to accept this is what happened. By me staying in this place, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to bring him back. But what it can do is to destroy me. I thought about also about parents who don't even know where their children are. They don't know whether they're dead or alive. At least I know where my child is. At least I know what my child did. Okay, so therefore that was solace for me. Then to accept the help that's out there for you. Whether it is counseling, whether it is getting involved into your faith, whether it's getting involved into a peer group, you have to find the process that works for you. There's not a one-size-fits-all healing process. If you lock a person up, but you really don't get to the core of why that person did what they did, then all you're doing is keeping them off the streets for a minute or two, and they come back out, sometimes worse than when they went in. What have you done in there that have made you change your way of thinking, your way of living within society? Rehabilitation is looking at each individual, understand where that individual come from, their background. We have people out here who are jobless, homeless, don't have an education, and finding out what is missing in their life that would make them whole. Locking them up with 10,000s of other people who are unwhole just like them, or giving them an opportunity to say, you know what, I need to be able to get this trade, and I can get it. I need to be able to get this education, and I can get it. It's each individual. What it's going to take for this one, what it's going to take for this one, what it's going to take for that one. Everyone you cannot put in a box, just like you can't put everybody in a jail cell and think they're going to come out without giving them some sort of rehabilitation, some sort of hope.
That's some powerful stuff, powerful conversation. We're going to take a short break right now. 15 minutes, we'll be back in the auditorium for the next segment of our conversations. Please be back here in 15 minutes. Hashtag is Smart on Crime. If you want more information about that video and others like it, there'll be something playing here in the auditorium, which will give you more information about Ever After. We'll be back in 15 minutes. Thanks.
When mom isn't there.
The kids that lived with her were doing bad things, and that's why she's there, because she was actually with those kids.
So basically, I lived in the home. I didn't sell these drugs. I didn't buy these drugs. I'm the girlfriend. Any crimes that he committed while we lived together, I was charged with.
The minute she heard that door knock and he said they had a warrant for her arrest, and I turned around and saw her, hugging the kids. That was tough because she knew already.
I want to try and tell your story, figure out a way to make something good out of all of this.
Thank you, brother.
I remember she always used to play with me, and she used to comb my hair.
The more I think about him, the more that those memories are slipping away.
It has been tough for the last 9 years without her being here.
There are thousands and thousands of people just like her, serving the same ridiculously insane sentences.
She did not go to the police, so she was guilty. What we cannot wrap our heads around as a family, as her brother, as her children, is the sentence that she received.
Missing my daughter to grow up. That's what I was sentenced to. I carry your heart, right?
Mm-hmm, and I carry your heart.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're not gonna want to miss the closing session here. This movie, The Sentence, I saw it. It just hits you. It just really, really hits you, and it covers so many important topics that we're facing in the criminal justice reform community. This is something that you're not going to want to miss. So please make sure that you stay for the afternoon session after lunch. Invite people as well, and we'll have a special discussion afterwards with the director of this film, Rudy Valdez, who is the brother of Cindy Shank, who is featured in this movie. So please don't miss that. I have the distinct pleasure now of introducing our next speaker. He's a lifelong city resident of Philadelphia. Mayor Jim Kinney grew up the oldest of 4 children in South Philadelphia, row home, and was sworn in as the 99th mayor of the city in 2016. In his first budget, the mayor worked closely with the city council to fund bold anti-poverty initiatives to make progress for every neighborhood. Right now, nearly 2,000 children are in quality pre-K, 11 community schools launched since this fall, and the work to rebuild parks, recreation centers, libraries, and everything else related to those quality of life issues continues, all because Philadelphia became the first major city to pass a tax on sweetened beverages that were used for these purposes. Mayor Kenney is here because he is also leading a number of criminal justice reform initiatives, public safety initiatives that are smart on crime, including a commitment to reduce the city's jail population by over 50% over the next 5 years. It's my pleasure to introduce Philadelphia's Mayor, Jim Kenney.
Thank you very much and good morning, and thanks for being here, and thanks for the invitation for me to be here. I want to thank the Center for American Progress for hosting this event and convening not only my fellow mayors, but also national experts around public safety and criminal justice. We're in a pivotal moment of justice reform in this country, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the work we've been doing in Philadelphia to safely reduce our jail population. I spoke recently in D.C. to another audience convened by CAT about community schools. I bring this up because both community schools and pre-K are part of the solution of the same problem. As mayor, we're investing in communities instead of incarceration. These investments will make us safer and help our city thrive. I'm proud to be a founding mayor of the Mayors for Smart Cities on Crime, because mayors understand the importance of reforming our criminal justice system and the impact this has on all of our communities. This work has been a cornerstone of our administration, which I believe is necessary to achieve the goals of promoting healthy and safe communities across our city. Back in 2015, Philadelphia embarked on a collaborative and data-driven reform effort to safely reduce the size of our jail population and reduce the rate of racial, ethnic, and economic disparities in our criminal justice system. With the generous support of the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge, we were able to develop an ambitious reform plan to cut our jail population by 34% over 3 years. As I stand before you today, I'm very happy to say that we've met this target, an entire year ahead of schedule. We have decreased our jail population by 36% since 2015, and we are not stopping there. We are continuing the difficult and important work of reform each and every day. We even closed one of our oldest and largest correctional facilities, the House of Correction, because there was no longer a need for it. We closed the creek, as they call it. We've been able to make change happen because of real and meaningful collaboration among partner agencies, our court system, district attorney, public defender, police department, jail system, behavioral health system, and our city council. We thank all of our partners for their diligence to this cause, including our chief defender, Keira Bradford Gray, who is here with us today in the audience. Yeah, you can give her a hand. She does a great job. When we started the reform effort, we recognized early on that too many people were being held in jail pre-trial that did not need to be there. And some people were being held because they could not pay the cost of bail. Now think of that. You get arrested for a DUI, a bail is set, you can't make bail, and you sit for 3, 4, 6 months at $130 a day on the taxpayer's dime. That's crazy. That's just economically crazy. So we have doubled our efforts to safely divert individuals away from the criminal justice system. Our police department has expanded the options they have when responding to individuals who commit low-level crime. They started using civil citations for nuisance behavior. The citation provides our officers with an option for a non-criminal response for crowd control and other disorderly conduct. We have also reduced our reliance on cash bail through the Early Bail Review Program. Our court system now reviews cases on a regular basis for those who are being held on low amounts of bail. This is the first step in our march towards a larger effort to eliminate money bail citywide. Going forward, we use a validated pretrial risk tool to determine the likelihood of recidivism and appearance in court. Our pretrial services department will have a robust range of release conditions as alternatives to incarceration. And public defenders will more frequently advocate for pretrial release at the bail hearing. We also recognize that the lengthy criminal justice process was driving our jail population up. In fact, Philadelphia's average length of stay is 3.5 times the national average. We're addressing this through our rigorous review of continuances and other bottlenecks. We are taking a critical look at our case management practices and identifying policy changes that will increase efficiencies across our entire system. We're also aiming to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated due to violations of probation by providing additional resources to our probation department. Probation officers are now able to refer people directly to substance use disorder treatment and provide for release on electronic monitoring. However, probation and parole detainers still make up almost 40% of the jail population on any given day. And we have approximately 40,000 people in our communities on probation and parole supervision. So we focus on cutting our probation caseloads by reducing the length of probation sentences and targeting those eligible for early termination. Critically important to the success of the efforts is enhancing data capacity. Like many jurisdictions, Philadelphia's criminal justice data has been siloed for many years. So we are working with all of our partners to standardize definitions, enhance data integrity, and generate analytics to track our progress. For too long, we have relied on our jails and prisons as a primary means for addressing behavioral health and substance abuse disorders. As in many jurisdictions, individuals with numerous serious mental illness are overrepresented in our Philadelphia jails. We are approaching this issue through a public health lens. Philadelphia is improving screening and assessment, increasing diversions, and enhancing linkages to community-based treatment. We've joined the Stepping Up initiative and are using its framework to create alternatives to incarceration that treat mental illness just as it is, an illness. Some efforts in the works include a diversion program for individuals who screen positive for mental illness when brought to a police station, and a co-responder program that would increase early intervention by law enforcement. These initiatives build on the highly encouraging results from the launch of our Police-Assisted Diversion Program, or PAD. PAD is focused on both front-end diversion for those with substance abuse disorders and on fostering relationships between police and members of the entire community. Philadelphia intentionally piloted PAD in a residential neighborhood where the majority of residents are people of color struggling with poverty, where there is a persistent level of violence, and where there are long-standing tensions between the police and its residents. Participating officers are heavily invested in community engagement efforts designed to develop the trust needed for people to accept help from a police officer in the first place. Our efforts have proved successful. The number of social referrals where an arrest is not necessary and someone can just request to be connected to services outpaced arrest referrals 2 to 1. And the recidivism rate for those who engage with the program is virtually zero. Soon we'll be expanding PAD to the area hardest hit by the opioid crisis. We're optimistic about this program as a tool for officers to engage with those suffering from opioid use disorder without trying to arrest our way out of the crisis and repeat the mistakes of the crack epidemic. Mass incarceration has touched the lives of so many Philadelphians, either directly or indirectly. That's why we've increased our efforts to engage in meaningful community engagement. We need to hear from those who have been through the system, those who work in the system, those who have been victims of crime, and families of these individuals. We're working on the creation of a community advisory committee so that our work can be informed by diverse community perspectives and to ensure that our initiatives are responsive to community needs. I'm excited to have these voices be more formally a part of this reform process. Reinvesting in our communities is a critical element to justice reform. With the depopulation of the House of Correction, we were able to expand our diversionary efforts. We hope that soon more savings will be available for community-based efforts. And we're currently exploring the feasibility of what we call community resource centers, often known as day reporting centers. We hope that this can be a model that further shifts resources, efforts, the entire system from costly incarceration to bringing services that can prevent justice involvement to people where they live. We've learned a lot through this process, and for one thing I must emphasize is collaboration. We didn't meet this goal through a series of individual policy changes made simply by one agency. It was because of different agencies, community groups, and other stakeholders were working side by side, united for the same goal. It was also driven by a mutual understanding that our bloated jail population was not a symptom of crime, but of systemic poverty. As mayor, I've also seen it is my role to enable this collaboration. I've committed considerable resources to convening all the stakeholders. We've increased staff in our Office of Criminal Justice for both larger strategies and individual initiatives alike. We've reallocated budgets to invest in the work of not just our administration, but all agencies to continue to work towards reform. The system is stronger and the reforms more sustainable when all aspects of the system are working together. But that doesn't mean this work hasn't been without its challenges. And with all things in government, efforts can take much longer than anticipated, and I hate that part of this process. I want to get this done as soon as possible, and it's difficult to wait and watch this thing evolve. Sustainable reform is a deliberate process and sometimes frustratingly slow. Another challenge is found on the streets of Philadelphia. While violent crime overall has dropped slightly, shootings and homicides sadly have risen. Philadelphia is also, like most cities, confronting a massive public health crisis with the opioid epidemic, as well as a resulting rise in homelessness. And one of the biggest challenges we face is that people of color still remain highly overrepresented in our criminal justice system. While we have seen substantial reductions in our jails, the rate of racial and ethnic disparities in the system has remained the same. We haven't been able to move the needle, and we need to do better. So racial equity will be a priority as we move forward with the extended plan. We're hoping to hire additional staff who can help apply a racial equity lens to all initiatives. Additionally, Philadelphia will continue its development of implicit and explicit bias training programs tailored to each criminal justice agency. Confronting our biases is essential to true change. Despite these challenges, we want to go even further. We are proposing an expanded reform plan that seeks to safely reduce our prison population by 50% from the 2015 baseline by the year 2020. Yes, that's 50% reduction by 2020, and I'm confident that we can safely achieve that. For too long, Philadelphia has led the nation as the most incarcerated big city in the country. But we are working tirelessly to change that and to break the cycle of poverty and incarceration that impacts so many of our citizens. We have developed a deep collaboration with our criminal justice and community partners that has enabled us to set an even higher goal of cutting our jail population in half over 5 years, reducing racial and ethnic disparities, and keeping our communities safe from harm. I believe we can achieve this vision together to create a more equitable criminal justice system that Philadelphians deserve. We're deeply grateful to the MacArthur Foundation for the leadership and support they have provided through this entire process. I also want to thank the Center for American Progress once again for bringing all of these stakeholders here today for this important conversation. And I'm looking forward to our continued collaboration as we reform our criminal justice systems for the better. And I just want to say that I'm 60 years old this year in August. I've born in Philadelphia, lived here, lived there my whole life, and will live there forever. And the thing that frustrates me the most is I know that our city, as great as it is, will never meet its full potential unless every one of its citizens meets their full potential. And that's why education and pre-K and the investments we're making in our schools are so, so important. Now, when I was in city council for about 23 years, I got to the prison, our county prison, a couple times. I didn't go up there much. But since I've been mayor, I've been there a number of times. And I can assure you that the people who are there, and I say people who are there, the souls who are there, are still vibrant. They still have hope. They still have capacity. They still have potential. And if we can reduce that population, get them the help that they need on their issues, on their addictions, their lack of training, lack of education, those folks can raise up to become really good, upstanding taxpayers and parents and citizens. And that's the real goal, is to make sure that everyone in our city does the best that they can with the God-given talents that they have. And we will not give up. There's no such thing as a throwaway person. No such thing as a throwaway person. And we will continue to work as hard as we can, sensitively as we can, with all of our partners together to make sure that we meet that goal. I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, but I want to set this train on the tracks to get where we need to be as a city that is equitable and fair and productive and successful. Thank you very much for being here.
So great to hear all the good things that are happening across the country. A lot of work still to do, but the leadership from cities and cities and states is really inspiring and encouraging. I want to bring up to the stage two other people who will share more things that are happening across states in this country. One of the great things I think about this conference, we intentionally tried to have a lot of different voices, different experiences, and I think we want to do, or this next panel or this next conversation will show the same regarding state progress. Mark Holden serves as a Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Koch Industries. He's also President and CEO of the Legal Division of Koch Companies Public Sector. Mark chairs the board of Freedom Partners, Chamber of Commerce, and serves on the board of directors for Americans for Prosperity. Mark is one of the foremost champions of criminal justice reform and has supported sentencing reform, prison reform, and reentry efforts across the country. He's joined in this conversation by Bill Keller, editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project. Bill worked for the New York Times from 1984 to 2014 as a correspondent, editor, and op-ed columnist. As a correspondent, he covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, winning a Pulitzer Prize at the end of White Rule in South Africa. From July 2003 until September 2011, he was executive editor of the Times. Please welcome Mark Holden and Bill Keller.
Let me start by stating the obvious, that criminal justice is one of those rare subjects where even in this polarized country, there is a demonstrable patch of common ground between left and right. You, and when I say you, I actually mean Charles Koch.
Wow, that's great, thank you.
You're a dead ringer for him.
Yeah.
You support sentencing reform, you support rehabilitation reforms in prison, you support a whole lot of things that would win endorsements from the ACLU just as readily, including giving the right to vote to people who've served their time for many crimes. But since President Trump and Jeff Sessions arrived in Washington, the tone has changed, and I'm curious whether that's put a strain on this coalition, and whether this sort of tough on crime tone has trickled down to the states where you do a lot of your work.
Well, I'll just start the first part, and thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is right now. So working with this White House, it's actually been really good, and I give a lot of credit to Jared Kushner for that. We haven't made as much progress as we want yet, but we have made some progress, and I'll talk about that. But you asked me about, is there a different mode, a different mood? Obviously in the campaign, there was a lot of the tough on crime stuff. But if you look at what's actually happening and what we're trying to get done now at the federal level, it's really more of the smart on crime, soft on taxpayer approach, which is what's led to the criminal justice reform revolution starting back in Texas in 2007. And so we've got a prison reform bill that went through the House at a vote. It was 360 to 59. And it is based on, get this, data and evidence, not on fear and emotion. Crazy. So it's not like we did with mandatory minimums, which was just who could be tougher and lock them up forever, which is a really dumb policy. And I think we should do away with all mandatory minimums, but I don't have that say. But the prison reform bill is a good bill. It's got a lot of things about rehabilitation in there. They're trying to make it so those who are incarcerated can stay more in touch with their families, the 500-mile rule, so no further than 500 miles from your home or your family based on your risk level and bed space. And there's a lot of other provisions in there as well, including letting outside groups in for programming, which I think is essential. And what we've seen, and probably everybody in this audience has seen, is there's been a lot of innovation in how to rehabilitate people over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that we've seen a lot of outside groups really embrace that. And we've seen state systems allow those groups to come in and work with incarcerated people so they get skills and deal with all those other issues, whether it's education, et cetera. So that's going to happen as well. I think at the, went to the Senate. The Senate, we're hopeful they're going to add some, I say it's minor sentencing reform, but since we've really not done a whole lot of sentencing reform ever at the federal level, I think it'll be really good. It's stalled right now. There's supposed to be a vote, a whip count after the midterms, and then hopefully a vote. And I think, that if it gets to the floor, it'll pass. And so that's one thing. The other thing I'll say real quickly so we can move on, we're also focused on clemencies. You've probably seen some of that with, Alice Johnson was released, which was awesome. I mean, she got a life sentence, and she shouldn't have ever received that, in my opinion, but there's so many other people in the federal system and state systems who need relief. And we've had some meetings on the clemency issue and the clemency process, and I'm heartened that I think that this White House, this administration, it's been disruptive in a lot of ways. Some really good, some not really good. But in this area, I do think that we're going to see changes, hopefully, to the clemency system so it's not run by the Department of Justice, because we know where that ends. I mean, they convicted all these people, and it's really hard for prosecutors or anybody to change their mind on things. And so
Alice Johnson got clemency because she had a celebrity sponsor, Kim Kardashian, who intervened on her behalf. Can you really see a guy who likes the individual power of the presidency as much as this one does, agreeing to systemic reforms that reduce his power and spread it out?
I don't think it'll reduce his power at all. We're talking about the Article 2 power he already has. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't need to go through DOJ. They've put that process in place. And Kim Kardashian is an advocate, and I give her a lot of credit. I don't care who advocates for these issues. I don't care, Republican, Democrat, whatever it is. If they're working and they're trying to get good stuff done, I'm with them. So I'm not going to play those games. You're right, that did draw attention to it, and it's drawn more attention to it, so much so that I really think, hopefully, in the next year or so, we can change the way that the clemency system works. And we've got a lot of people from the left and right in these meetings, like Mark Osler, who's an expert, Rachel Barkow, who's an expert on this. So we've got, I think, people who really, Brittany Barnett, you might know, that was Alice's lawyer. She's also Chris Young's lawyer, if you know Chris Young's case. I'm hoping he gets clemency soon. There's more and more to come, and I do think that this issue, it plays to every president likes the idea of power, I'm sure. This president does, for sure. But it's really opening his eyes to who goes to prison and for how long in this country, and that's important. So he's starting to see the injustice. And it was after the Alice Johnson commutation is when the president okayed putting the 4 reforms into the Senate side of the bill. So I think he's learning about these issues as he goes along, which is all you can ask for with anybody.
Okay. The Koch network advocates what you call a free market approach to criminal justice reform. Help me understand what that means. Does it mean a larger role for private companies? How does that work?
Excuse me. I don't know if we advocated for the criminal justice system. We think in general free markets are better than a centrally controlled economy. The criminal justice system, for it to be, I don't know how a free market economy would work there. What we want in a criminal justice system is a system that's more just, that enhances public safety for everyone, and that provides second chances for people who pay their debt to society. We believe, we look at it through 3 lenses: the moral case, the constitutional case, and the fiscal case. And the moral case is very easy. You all know it. Brian Stevenson laid it out best. It's a 2-tiered system. The rich and guilty get better deals than the poor and innocent. And, it's a system where we basically, in my opinion, do the exact opposite on all these issues than we should do if we really wanted people to come out better and not do more crime and not be a burden on their families and society. And then there's the constitutional case. Almost 50% of the Bill of Rights deals with criminal justice issues and the rights of the individual. 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment. Those, in my opinion, those amendments are violated basically every single day. If you don't have money, you don't have a lawyer, you're going to get run over. And then the last part of it we look at is the fiscal case, and the fiscal case becomes the moral case. And yeah, it's drawn a lot of conservatives to criminal justice reform. And as I like to say, they come for the savings, but they stay for the salvation. I mean, so they see what works. And it started in Texas, and Texas, red state Texas under Rick Perry, and they were going to build a new prison, and instead they decided to not put as many people into prison, divert them, and then also for those who were in prison, start to train them, rehabilitate them. And then look what happened. They've closed 8 prisons, saved $4 billion, and they have a crime rate they haven't seen this low since the 1960s. That's what we want. We want fewer people in prison. We want a smaller criminal justice system, and we think the system needs to be changed from beginning to end. And I mean, I'm talking like asset forfeiture needs to go away. It's unconstitutional. We need bail reform consistent with the 8th Amendment. It needs to be based on risk, not on resources. We need prosecutorial reform. We need to make sure that judges are making the calls on most of these things, all of them, not prosecutors. That's the problem. Our prosecutors have way too much in this system, too much power. They're the prosecutor. They're also the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And we need to stop that. We need to make sure that the 6th Amendment is followed every single day, meaning that people get lawyers who need them. We know more than 80% of the people in the system end up needing some type of court-appointed lawyer, and we just don't have that. It's a constitutional crisis. It's a disgrace, and we let it happen again and again. A lot of states are making progress there. New York's done some things. Mississippi's going to do some things. Michigan has got some reforms, but that needs to be reformed. Sentencing, that needs to be reformed. Then we need to reform the way prisons are run so people come out better. It's about rehabilitation and redemption, not just retribution and punishment. And then lastly, it's going to have back-end reforms as far as collateral consequences. The second prison, where someone gets out, pays their debt to society. In our opinion, consistent with public safety, you should get all your rights back. And that includes voting rights. We're very much on board with the Florida referendum. Hopefully it passes. I think it's Amendment 4 or whatever, on restoring rights of people who have paid their debt to society. It's important because if we don't give everybody back their rights, we treat them as second-class citizens, don't be surprised when they end up in the system again because they can't get jobs, they can't get loans, they can't be part of our society. So all that needs to happen. And once that happens, maybe it'll be more free market. But we got work to do.
Let's talk a little bit about money. I mean, we all know the analogy that's made that a year in the penitentiary costs as much as tuition to a good college.
Or a bad college, yeah.
Right, or a bad college. But the alternatives aren't free. You talk about rehabilitation, drug treatment, education, job training, housing, all the things that the people who are incarcerated need post-incarceration. California has reduced its incarceration rate by 9%, and its state prison budget is as high as it's ever been. So is it a little bit illusory to say that there's this pot of taxpayer savings at the end of the rainbow?
No, it's real. I mean, I told you what's happened in Texas. South Carolina's closed at least 4 prisons, saved almost $500 million. Michigan's closed 11 prisons, saved hundreds of millions of dollars. It can be done. I think California is probably working through the system. They're the biggest state, right? So they're going to probably have more to deal with. But yeah, these things cost money. But the reality is, we've got to fix the system first, and that, the criminal justice system. But if we did more things on the front end with education and supporting communities and having real jobs and opportunities in some of the communities where a lot of people end up in prison, that would help as well. So all of this stuff costs a whole lot of money. A lot of the states are saving a ton of money now because they've employed these practices, and I think that's the trend. It ends up that people come out, rehabilitated, they can get a job, they have a skill, they're less traumatized. They come out and they're productive members of society. They're with their families. They're an addition, an add to their communities, not a detractor. Keeps law enforcement safer. So yeah, it's expensive. All this stuff's expensive, but we spend, over $250 billion a year on the criminal justice system in this country, over $80 billion a year, on incarceration in this country, and that's 3 to 4 times more per capita than we spend on K through 12 education in this country. And it's all about priorities. I always say this: you are what you eat. You definitely are what you spend. And so, if you look at how we're spending our money, we must want to incarcerate people more than educate them. I don't think that's true, and I think that's changing. But it's all very expensive. But we need to spend the money on the front end. You get better results on the back end. In Texas, when they were going to build a $2 billion prison, instead they spent $500 million on rehabilitation programs and beefing up their diversionary programs, and it's saved them now over $4 billion. Smart on crime. That's the way to go.
Are the conservatives who are with you on closing the prisons going to be with you when it comes to putting up money for all these alternatives?
But what I'm saying is when you start to close that down, when you start to decarcerate, when you have, and it's got to be more than that. When I went through all that litany, I forgot to mention the number of laws we have in this country. It's ridiculous. I mean, at the federal level, 6,000 federal criminal laws we don't really know. But we've got too many laws which lead to too many fines and fees and all this other stuff that happens. So when you start to get the system right-sized, which a lot of the states are trying to do more and more of, and the economy picking up helps that as well, which also, it creates a virtuous cycle where people coming out of prison now, for example, in Michigan, at the Hanlon State Prison, where they have this amazing education program and also a vocational village, the folks coming out of prison are getting jobs right away with good jobs, some of them six-figure jobs because they're skilled up. So doing these things, it all makes sense. It saves money. Conservatives are fully on board with this stuff about saving the money part, and I think the left is too, because you have more money left to do other things that need to happen instead of just locking people up and making us less safe. The practices that have worked in the 30-plus states have all shown that you can reduce incarceration rates, you can reduce crime rates, and you reduce the spending on it. And so it's just common sense. I mean, it's ridiculous that you don't do it. The tough on crime stuff is so fake and so phony. Everybody knows it, but they still try to do it. And I think it only works sometimes in elections, definitely at the federal level still, because they're like in a time warp and, you know, everybody, they are. So you got people from these laws were passed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the people that passed them are still in power, and they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and trying to get them to change it. But even if it's going to change there, too. And I think hopefully it'll change after the midterms. We'll get at least the prison reform part done.
Okay. The latest Koch initiative is called Safe Streets and Second Chances, and it's studying the reentry experience of inmates in 4 states, I think. What do you hope will come of that?
We hope that it's successful and that people...
What would success look like?
Success would be people coming out of prison and once they engage in the programs, having a productive life and transforming themselves. Now, we're in 4 states and we have a number of partners, so it's Koch Industries, it's the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is right on crime. We also are partnering with the Charles Koch Institute and Florida State University. And so what we're doing, we're in 4 states, like you mentioned. We're in Texas, we're in Pennsylvania, we're in Florida, and we're in Kentucky. And our goal is ultimately to scale this up so we're much more engaged before they come out of prison, so to speak.
This is more data gathering than...
It's data gathering, but it's also, yeah, it's data gathering. We need data. I mean, that's what's driven, obviously, the criminal justice reform movement for the past 10, 15 years. It's data and evidence-based. Once you have data and evidence-based, even the most, you talked about Jeff Sessions, I mean, even he sometimes believes that stuff too. When you've got actual evidence that shows that what you're doing makes people safer, costs less money, keeps law enforcement safer, how do you say no to that? So what we're doing is we're in these 4 states, and we've got about 1,100 or so people total, and we're doing it in prisons in urban areas in these states and in rural areas. And the whole idea is we're going to watch how these individuals do as they come out of prison and follow them in their progress over the next year or so. And our whole idea is, it's probably a moonshot and pie in the sky, but the whole idea, the whole mentality we want to start, we're not starting it, it's happened. A lot of people talk about this, and we're learning from other groups that have done this, but reentry needs to begin day 1 of incarceration. That's the whole idea. The end of the line, when you're in, hopefully will help do that. And what we're doing is half of the individuals in the program are going to get whatever the state institutions provide in reentry. So whatever those programs are. And I'm sure that'll be a mixed bag. That's kind of how it is everywhere. And the other half are going to get a program that's been set up by our chief researcher. It's Carrie Pettis Davis. She's at Florida State University. She was at Washington University in St. Louis for many years. And she and her team have studied like 100,000 plus different reentry programs, incarceration issues, you name it, over the past decade. And they've got this 5 key models program that they think works. And what they're going to do is half of them, like I said, get ours, half of them get the state's program. We're going to work with local providers because we're not going to do this top-down approach, big government approach, which doesn't work. What we want to do is learn from the individuals in these areas what works in the different nonprofits that are helping people reenter, whatever it is, mental health, drug addiction, skills, whatever it might be, housing. And then we're going to compare notes over the next year or so and see who got better outcomes. That's the bottom line, as far as recidivism, employment, how people's lives are. And we've done the first round of data, and it was just a Q&A, or no, just questionnaires for the individuals who had volunteered. And this goes back to what I've always believed. If you've ever heard me speak before, you always hear the same thing, so you probably remember this. But I worked in a prison when I was younger, and then and there were a bunch of kids I grew up with who were incarcerated, who they wanted to succeed, but once they were in prison, it was over. They couldn't. There was no chance. They had no resources. It was brutal. Just you couldn't. Once you're in the system, you can't get out. You can't get a job, etc. And when another job I had, I was a janitor in a factory outside of my hometown of Worcester. And every day they'd bring in guys from the local work release to augment our crew. And there were about 8 of them, and of the 8 guys, usually at least 6 of them are really good guys, and 2 might be jerks, which is better than the average in people outside in society, in my opinion. So, just saying. But my point is, those guys wanted to succeed too, but there was no way back then. It just wasn't something that we did, or our society did, or definitely our governments weren't doing these types of things. So we've done this first round, and the individuals who are coming out, it's not a surprise to me. They've all had great trauma. I mean, all the stories you all know. A loved one was murdered in front of them. They saw a loved one killed, or they had to handle a dead body. They were, a lot of them, most of them had trauma, violence done to them, et cetera, et cetera. So the story everybody knows, one of the common denominators, which is just heartbreaking, but just the way it is. But the other part is they all had great hope for the future. They want to work more. They want to learn more. They want to practice their faith. They want to have a productive, relationship with another person or people or their families. They want to just be a part of society. They want to be a part of this. None of that is surprising. But the fact that they still believe in that, and these individuals have, been in, some of them in prison a long time. We don't have any say about who goes into this program. It's all randomized, and we get whoever they give us. So it's all types of offenses. So we're tracking all of that, and we're hopeful over the next year we'll be able to see what is working on our side, what we're doing with these local providers to help people rehabilitate and get back on their feet and have a productive life, and hopefully ultimately transformation. And we're going to compare notes with what the outcomes from the state institutions. And, there's a lot of great research out there on these issues, and from a lot of really, really bright people who I respect a lot. And they do these really long studies, or, a decade and a half plus or whatever. And that's important stuff, but we're going to fail fast and hopefully then succeed fast, because we don't want to wait anymore. I mean, people need help now, and we're hopeful that our program can be part of that discussion going forward, whether it gets folded into what the institutions are doing, or we get in more and more states. We've already got 6 or 7 other states that are interested in being a part of this. The other part of what we have, so we've got, we think, really good research with Carrie and her team. We're also working with Right on Crime. And John Kufos, some of you might know, he was with the New Jersey Reentry Corporation. He's now with Right on Crime. We hired him to work with us. John's an amazing guy, got an amazing story. He's a lawyer, he was in prison, now he's back out. And what John does, he's working on the policy side of it. So whether it's at the federal level with the bills that are going through, he's up there advocating for that. But if there's an issue in a state that we're in, or maybe even if we're not in, if he hears about it, he goes in and advocates and gets it cleaned up. So for example, he was helpful down in Mississippi with some of the reforms they were doing on fines and fees. And he's working in other states. If there's some ridiculous regulation that keeps someone who learned to be a plumber or a carpenter in prison, then when they get out, they can't get an occupational license because of their criminal record, he'll work to try to get rid of that regulation. So John's part of that team. So we're trying to really get the best in policy, the best in research to get the best outcomes. And like I said, our goal, we'd love to be in all 50 states, whatever that looks like. That's a ways to go. We're in the proof of concept right now, had our first data come in. We're going to have more probably in another month or so, and we'll just keep going. And it's, you know, we're in it for the long term no matter what, because it's interesting, this whole thing on the federal level and the tough on crime. Everybody understands, I think now, by and large, even the tough on crime crew, whatever that means anymore, that people who are in prison, 95% or whatever, are getting out. It's just common sense that we need to have people coming out better than they went in. It's the moral thing to do, but it just makes a lot of sense so they don't reoffend and don't end up going back into prison, because people, generally speaking, don't get better going back and forth into prison.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which is the role of prosecutors, prosecutors' discretion in inflating the population of our prisons. George Soros has an approach to that, which consists of helping identify reform candidates for district attorneys around the country and recruiting them and helping to finance their campaigns. And there have been a number of successes, as you know, St. Louis, Chicago with Kim Foxx and some others. Philadelphia, a couple of the Florida cities. Have you considered doing anything of the kind?
No, not necessarily. We've thought about that issue. We've been mostly focused at the federal level on those issues. But I mean, I think it's great. I think this goes back to we need a lot of acts of Congress and everything else to get some of these laws set up and changed so people can have a chance, or we don't put them in prison for so long. So acts of Congress are important, but it's more, in my opinion, at the local level is where most of the people are in prison anyway, where you can make even a bigger difference. And that's why it's so important from our perspective that people who have paid their debt to society need to come back in and be a part of it, and that's voting. So, you know, they should be voting on these issues locally for district attorney and whatever else. So I think it's a great thing. I think that more importantly even than that is it's beyond even the acts of Congress and the local people that you elect. It's also just citizens helping each other out, and whether it's reentry programs or ban the box if you're an employer like we have for many years, hired people with criminal records, all that's important. But I think what George Soros is doing, and to the extent he's funding that or he's got one of his groups doing it, I think it's great. I think people need to be more engaged and involved in their communities, and that will make the biggest difference if politicians start to hear from people more. It's that old saying they won't see the light till you bring the heat. And the reality is that politics is downstream from culture, and politicians are the biggest followers around. They'll get in front of the parade real quick once they think it's something popular. And this is something that's more and more popular that you can run on now. We did polling for the First Step Act with one of the groups I work for, and it was a 70% issue on average, and that included conservatives. And there are conservatives who now say this is a plurality of conservatives who are going to be likely voters in the midterms. They will come out and vote for people who are in favor of criminal justice reform. So I think we're past the Willie Horton era. We are from a societal perspective, I think, especially in the States. We now have to do more and more to just end all of that, the way we've been set up for the last 30 years with the system.
We did a story at the Marshall Project back in, I think, 2016 about the Coke industry's giving to prosecutorial races, and it turned out that a lot of that money was going to candidates who were tough on crime, but not so tough on environment.
That wasn't us. I mean, we talked about that at the time. I reread the interview. We've never funded any of these local prosecutor races, so I don't know. I love you, but I don't remember that. I'm sorry.
You can look it up, themarshallproject.org.
No, I read the interview. I'm telling you we didn't do it, I promise.
I can't resist asking a question that flows naturally from that, which is Jane Mayer, the Boswell and Bête Noire of the Koch family.
He's going to talk French. I have no idea what he's saying.
She wrote a piece saying that that Charles Koch's interest in reform is a branding exercise designed to soften the company's image as a polluter. I don't have any reason to doubt Mr. Koch's sincerity, but is this for Koch Industries, at least in some degree, a matter of commercial self-interest?
Let me answer it this way. If this was a publicity deal, a PR stunt, you think I'd be the face of it? I got a face for radio and and a voice for print. I mean, so, and if it were, it's the slowest release one probably ever. We're in our 12th or 13th year. So, you know, I love the First Amendment, and Jane Mayer can think whatever she wants to think and obviously write whatever she wants. That's cool with me. But that's not what this is about. The Koch Industries of the world, the Charles Kochs of the world, the Mark Holdens of the world, you know, if we or our kids get in trouble, we'll be okay, right? I mean, we can afford lawyers and all that stuff, but it's everybody else who gets screwed. And you know, it's most everybody in society gets run over by the criminal justice system. Middle class, working class, poor, it doesn't matter. So for us, it's about, whether you believe it or not, making it a better society, making it a society that's more just, you know, a society based on equal rights, second chances, redemption, and a society where people are always out to try to help each other improve their lives. And then once you help someone improve their life, that person goes on and improves someone else's life. And that's what I've seen a lot of in the criminal justice movement and in the different groups we work with. You know, from the ACLU, the Center for American Progress, you name it, we've worked left and right and center. And what really is heartening to me, I always say this, when I do these panels and they've got individuals who've been in the system or formerly incarcerated, everybody is more interested in hearing about them and hearing their stories and seeing them. And I'm talking about people from, you know, all white audiences, whatever else. People gravitate to this once they understand it better. It gets back to Brian Stevenson's thing about proximity. When you're proximate to it, when it's one just, yeah, we're tough on crime, Willie Horton, and you demagogue it, you know, that we get bad outcomes. But when people meet people who've been in the system, it changes them. And that's why I think there should be one more criminal law passed, and that should be that before anybody can pass another punitive criminal justice statute penalty, they need to go visit someone in prison and meet people in prison, because they'd be shocked by it. It changes you, changes your mind. That's my point of view.
Thanks. The shot clock has just gone off. I have a bank of zeros here, so we're out of time. Thanks, Mark, for putting up with this.
Thank you.
All right, now's the opportunity for everybody that's out there in the audience to come and out in the lobby to come on in. So please go tell the folks that are outside it's clear they can come in now. So yes, I'm stalling for a minute. So good afternoon, or what time is it? It's still morning. Good morning. Oh, it's afternoon. Good morning. I can't tell if you're here. Oh, good. So, for those of you who don't know, my name is Carol Mason, and I'm the president of John Jay College right now. But the exciting part is that I get to introduce someone that I've known for nearly 40 years. Yes, we met in the womb. But she is my best friend, and I've known her since my first days at the University of Michigan Law School back in 1979. And she didn't know until right now that I was going to be the one introducing her. And so she went, uh-oh. But I have nothing but wonderful things to say about her. You will see from this conversation she's about to have with the mayor of Stockton how open and warm she is. So I was, 1979, leaving the dining room at the University of Michigan Law School, and she was coming in, and she just said, "Hi, what's your name?" and started a conversation, and who do you know? And of course, when you talk to anybody long enough, you know someone in common, and her cousin went to college with me, and that was the beginning of a 40-year friendship. But that's not why she's here today. She's here because of the wonderful things that she's accomplished and the wonderful things that she's done in her own right. But one of the things that propelled her life to the national stage is that she mentored the woman who became the First Lady of the United States and became best friends with the first couple of the United States. Now, I know that this is a nonpartisan event, but those of you who know me know that President Obama is near and dear to my heart. I spent 8 years in that administration working with Valerie Jarrett when she was the senior advisor to the president, and she oversaw the White House Office on Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs, and she chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls.
She developed a program called It's On Us, aimed at ending sexual assault on college campuses. She worked on closing the pay gap because women still earn 80 cents to the dollar from what men make, and that's even worse for women of color. And she advised the president on issues such as gun control, criminal justice reform, and immigration reform. And I have to tell you that she's a fierce advocate for reform. We had weekly Sunday brunch, and I remember a very tough discussion about why we weren't doing certain things at the Department of Justice. And I had the benefit of having the money, the $4 billion that went to state and local governments to deal with criminal justice reform, and she challenged me on a regular basis on what was I doing to support reform, what was I doing to support our state and local governments who were there to make lives better for our citizens. So she is going to have a conversation today with somebody that she's known for a long time and that she mentored as well. So there's a trend you'll see, and they'll tell you the story, but if you have the opportunity to be mentored by her or to be a friend of hers, take it. So she met the now Mayor Tubbs, who's the mayor of the city of Stockton, when he was in college at Stanford. Michael took office in January 2017, and he was the city's first African-American mayor and the country's youngest mayor of a city of over 100,000 people. He's initiated some very successful programs in Stockton, leading to more students entering and graduating from college, a reduction in gun violence, and an enhanced social safety network for the city's most vulnerable people. So please join me in welcoming Valerie Jarrett and the Mayor of Stockton, Mayor Tubbs, for a conversation.
Well, hello, everybody. How are you guys doing? Carol, I should say President Carol Mason, I appreciate that wonderful introduction, and I don't know why you had to tell everybody we've known each other almost 40 years. I've been making things up for a while, and she just outed us both, but it's been, in all seriousness, a joy of my life to be friends with her, and I'm so proud that she has an opportunity to lead this incredible institution and convening once again this conference. So, Mr. Tubbs, I love saying Mr. Tubbs because I knew him back when he was not Mr. Tubbs. I'm delighted to have you here. Not long ago, we had a chance to sit on a stage together, and the table was turned. He was interviewing me. And so now I am delighted to be holding onto the mic and getting to ask the questions. And I didn't tell him what any of them were ahead of time, so it's gonna be fun. But I'll start with a softball. So, I always think it's helpful to appreciate vision and leadership when we understand concept and what your life was like up until the time we met.
Well, again, thank you so much. It is very ironic that the tables have turned. I was just getting coffee, not even for her, but for people under her, 8 years ago. So it's definitely a surreal moment, and thank you, John Jay, for having us. And thank you for the work you all do. I know in Stockton, a lot of people I'm most grateful for the folks every day who are doing the violence interruption work and pushing us to think about how to make our justice system actually just. But in terms of me, born and raised in Stockton, and a lot of the issues around criminal justice reform are things that are very personal for me, and I think that's where the passion comes from. So my father's been incarcerated for the last 25 years. He's still incarcerated to this day. And I decided to run for local office because one of my cousins was a victim of a homicide in Stockton while I was interning in the White House. And I used to be really ashamed of that. But I realized, especially in the work we're doing now in Stockton and talking to folks who are victims and perpetrators of violent crime, and understanding that the ecosystem of our lives are so similar that these outcomes shouldn't be surprising. My mother, she had me at 17 years old, so she was teen, so we grew up in intense poverty. In neighborhoods that I would argue were structured for violence. Neighborhoods with failing schools, neighborhoods with more liquor stores than grocery stores, neighborhoods with more check cashing places in banks, neighborhoods where folks were working harder and harder only to fall further and further behind. So all the work we're doing in Stockton is really motivated by not just things I read at Stanford, but things I lived. And I would argue that lived experience isn't everything, but I think it's very helpful to add nuance. So when we're talking about numbers and statistics and percentages, for me, they're not just numbers. They're people, they're cousins, they're fathers, they're people who have made me who I am today.
All right, so let me stop you there because I think all too often when people talk about the criminal justice system, they do focus on the data, but they also talk about usually the person incarcerated, and they forget that there's a whole family that surrounds that person. So could you talk a little bit more about what it was like to have a father incarcerated, and when you were in school, and what the pressures were that put on your mom and your entire family?
I would say at first, growing up, it was a cause of a lot of like shame. I think especially we have this idea that everyone who's currently locked in a cage in our country are there because they're bad people. And I'm sure some are, but I'm not sure everyone is. People make bad choices, but there's also policy choices that help influence the bad choices individuals make. So growing up, I used to be terribly ashamed of that, so I would lie all the time. They're like, what does your dad do? I would say things like, oh, I don't know him. Or I say things, oh, he's no longer here. Or if I was feeling extra snarky,
How old were you when he was first incarcerated?
Well, literally, when I was born, he was in the juvenile detention facility. And he was out for maybe a year or two when I was 2 and 3, and then back in, and then out for a little bit and back in. And it was a 3 strikes, where's the law in the time in California, so then he got 25 for life. When I feel especially snarky, I would say things like, oh, he makes license plates, and no one knew that, right? But no one knew what that meant. And it was a cause, I think, of a lot of anger as well, just feeling that something was wrong and watching my mom struggle and her stress and her anxiety and working incredibly hard to try to provide for 2. But I think it was also a real source of strength. It gave me a real chip on my shoulder because I would hear I remember all these statistics about like kids whose parents are incarcerated are more likely to be incarcerated themselves, and I really internalized that and took that as a challenge. And I think that's why through high school I was super focused. But then when I got to college, I realized that, wow, that there's a whole, I remember going to a convening of the Children's Defense Fund about the cradle to prison pipeline during my freshman year in college. And I was like, wow, there's a reason why not just my father, but so many kids from my neighborhood, so many of my friends were caught up in the system. And the reason can't solely be because they're bad people who make bad choices and didn't work hard enough. And that just became a passion point for me to really think about if policy could be used in a way that kind of takes people away from families or doesn't really help rehabilitate people, then maybe there's a way for policy to actually help engender good outcomes. And that's kind of why I do the work I do now.
So the mayor and I went to the same college. I went there because my freshman year of high school, a very, very handsome man came into my library at my high school, and the librarian introduced me to him, and he said, I'm at Stanford. And so I decided I was going to Stanford because he was really cute. And I'm telling you, no one could tell me anything else. I'd never visited the campus. I didn't know much about it other than that one really cute guy who was probably long since gone by the time I got there. So what motivated you to decide that you wanted to go to Stanford? I assume it was not a really cute girl. But and how did you do it? Did you have teachers who took an interest in you? What happened in your life besides your very young mother that propelled you to go to such a great school?
Yeah, well, actually, I didn't want to go to Stanford.
Uh-oh, how come?
Well, I think
interview over.
But growing up in Stockton, the narrative was to be successful meant you had to leave and get as far away from Stockton as possible. So my mom would indoctrinate me from the time I was 7. She would say things like, you could be anything you want to be in the world. And I believe that. And then she also said, you have to get away from Stockton. You have to leave. There's nothing here. To be successful means you leave. So I really internalized that. So when I was applying for colleges, I went to go all the way on the East Coast. So I applied to like mostly East Coast schools, and then my last application was to Stanford. And there was this question about intellectual vitality. And I know what that was. So I said, Mom, I ain't going here. They talk asking questions. I don't want to go to a school that wants me to, what does that even mean? And she was like, just do it. It's your last application. It's a free application. And then ended up getting in and realizing that being 2 hours away from home wasn't too bad. And also being a 17-year-old, I thought Stanford was like a medical school. So I was like, I'm not going to med school. I want to be a lawyer or something. And then actually visiting, I'm like, oh, no, it's not. There's people do all type of things here. And the weather's nice, and it's not too far from home. So that's kind of how I decided. In terms of how I got there, very blessed with great mentors. There was one woman in particular. Her name was Carolyn Lawrence, and she was a private college admissions consultant. So she would charge tens of thousands of dollars to help kids apply to the top schools. And I met her online. And not a sketchy form, in like a college.
It's getting back to my story, how I got there.
A website called College Confidential, and I just sent her a message like, hey, I'm this year, I'll be the first in my family to go to college. My mom makes less than $40K. These are my grades. Can you help me? And she just took me on as one of her clients. So she helped me build a college list. She taught me like simple things like, don't apply to college with an email that says love to b-ball. And I was like, why not? Like, I love basketball. Like, why would I not put that on my application? That's me. She's like, trust me, first.last@gmail. Like little things like that. But it's funny, but if she had not told me that, 'cause I was doing this all by myself, I would have sent the emails with love to b-ball at AOL.com. So I was lucky in that way. And I was also lucky that my mom and my grandmother, although they're not highly educated, they really stretched education. Like bringing a B home was like a crisis in the family. Anytime I got in trouble in class, I would like call them and they would take off work somehow and just be there, sit in the classroom and figure out what happened and yell at me and the teacher like we both have to figure this out. So from a very early age, I felt protected and knew that school was one path to a better life for me and myself and my family.
So the mayor and I met at Stanford when I was asked to give a lecture called the St. Clair Drake Lecture. And Professor St. Clair Drake was my favorite professor when I was at Stanford. And so it was an easy hook to get me to go back. And he had passed away years earlier, and so I was honored to do it. So at the end of my lecture, then Michael comes up to me, like right up on the stage, and he said something to the effect of, I really would like to have an internship on the Hill. Can you help me? And I said, why would you want to work on the Hill? Why wouldn't you want to work in the White House? And so he said, that never occurred to me. So he applied. He met my chief of staff, who was right there on the spot, and he applied, and he got in on the merits. But what made you come up to me like that? Because only like one other person did it. Most people at the end of a lecture, they go away. You did not. You must have had intention. What was going through your mind?
Well, I was...
And why did you think you wanted to work on the Hill?
So I was 19. I was straight out of South Stockton, so I'm still figuring out the Stanford thing. And I don't know, you just remind me a lot of the women in my life who were like super helpful. So I said, this is President Obama's mentor, so there's nothing I can say that's impressive, but I can at least say hi. So actually I went up and I was worse than asking for an internship. The first thing I said was, I'll be in DC in the fall. Can we get a cup of coffee?
I repressed that because that was crazy.
And then you smiled and you said, and then I said, you're like, what will you be doing there? And I really wanted to do I wanted to do policy work. So I said, I'm gonna work and by the way, I didn't even apply for the Stanford and Washington program yet. I was speaking into existence. The application wasn't even due, but I knew I was gonna be in DC. So I said, oh yeah, I wanna work at the Department of Education. And you're like, why don't you work in the White House? And then I was like, I want to do education policy. And then he said, go talk to my chief of staff. So thank you for your wisdom and your foresight. Because
I thought it was a Hill. I'm glad to know at least it was the Department of Education. Yeah. I knew it was something other than the White House. So, all right, so you came to the White House, you blew it away. Everybody in your program and around the building was so impressed with you. Tell us, after you finished school, what did you think about doing? And did you always know you wanted to go back to Stockton? Or particularly since your mom had told you, get out of Stockton, what changed that reversed that course for you?
Well, I think it was just the timing, honestly. So being there in fall 2010, it was right when the Tea Party had taken back the House. So a lot of the idealism was tempered by this like Washington gridlock and stalemate. And I remember being there every day and seeing just how hard everyone was working and still just trying to push things, but it was hard. But then at the same time, I was on the intergovernmental affairs team, working with the mayors and councils. So every day I would come in and do a memo or sit in on the meeting and take notes of a mayor or council member who were doing things for their cities. And I remember thinking at the time, like, wow, maybe the locus of change in this country is not just national or mostly national, that maybe it's at the local level that you can really move things for 100, 200, 300,000, 400,000 people. So then I said, you know what? My family is still in Stockton, so I want to make sure I use my experiences, kind of my network, to really support good candidates in Stockton so they have the same level of governance that I'm seeing in other cities. Because at that time, like Senator Booker was mayor of Newark, Secretary Castro was mayor of San Antonio. There was like all these mayors, Mayor Nutter was mayor of Philadelphia, like all these mayors that with some gravitas were like pushing things forward. I was like, wow, really impressive. And then while having that internal conversation, that's when my cousin was murdered at a house party on Halloween. And I think for me, it was going back home and having to actually deal with raw emotions, pain, and anger, and figure out.
How old was your cousin?
I was 20, so he was 21. And to just deal with the pain, the emotions, and then understand that it was one thing to be successful, but I was like, how are the folks that I grew up with, how are they benefiting from this success? That there had to be a deeper reason around sort of why things had gotten so well for me, other than just me making a lot of money. So then I went back home for a break during my senior year and had to have a conversation with my mom, and she was not having it. She was like, "What do you mean?" And I was like,
I told you not to come back here.
She's like, and you do what? Run for city council? No. And I was like, Mom, like I really feel like I have to do it, and if I lose, I'll have a great interview answer. So like, let's just do it. I still have my degrees. Jobs aren't going anywhere. I can still get a job, but I have to do this. And I think for me, it's been incredibly rewarding because the work's not easy, but just to be able to even change the conversation we're having in Stockton. So it's not that folks are bad people, but there's bad, unjust systems. And we can't control individual actions, but we can control the way all our systems work and how we work together with the goal of actually helping people. Or even the conversation we're having about victims and perpetrators of crime, often being, at least violent crime, often being one and the same. And also just a conversation around investments. Like, where do you want to spend our precious taxpayer dollars, and how do we make sure we get the best bang for our buck? So, again, I'm just incredibly thankful for the tough decision around, because I think it's easy to sit in anger. Like, being angry and frustrated, that's actually easy. Like, it takes no effort. But really figuring out a way to channel that anger in a way was very therapeutic for me, and that was kind of my way of dealing with the grief, I think. And now understanding that not just in Stockton, but it sees across this nation, there's so many families, so many cousins, sisters, brothers, mothers, sons who have to deal with that. It makes it even much more special and that much more sacred.
All right, one more thing about your bio. So you're sitting on the city council. How many are on the city council in Stockton?
6.
And you come in as the junior member of the city council, and then you decide to run for mayor. What were you thinking?
It's like my mom. So, because when I told her I was running for...
I am a mom. That's what we say.
When I told her I was running for mayor, she said, why? You spent 4 years, you did good things, you paid your debt, like, you're good, like, go. I was like, Mom, I got to do this. So now she's excited because you only get 2 terms as mayor. So she's like, at the most, you're going to be here for 2024. Then you have to find something else to do. So she's like... She has a countdown. She's I think this will be the first campaign kickoff. She's excited for it. It's the last one. Anyway.
Is it the last one, or are you going to look for another office?
It will have to be the last one locally. And
I know. That's not what I asked you.
So I think.
Right? Don't you think? Your public service is not over, my friend.
I think if there's another office that makes sense, or even supporting someone else in the office, I'll be happy to deeply consider it. What was the question?
You answered it. It was, how did you get to be mayor? All right.
I'll tell you the story. It's a good story.
Tell a story then.
So it's been 4 years on city council, and during that time, worked with the police chief to create our Office of Violence Prevention and work on our violence reduction strategy, open up health clinics, shut down liquor stores, a lot of work, and it was all centered in my district, South Stockton. So about halfway through the term, people would start coming to council meetings and just yell at me for only caring about South Stockton. So for like 6 months, I was just upset. Like, I was like, why am I being penalized for doing a good job? Like, what? Council person for South Stockton is doing too much work for South Stockton? Like, how is that a bad thing? But people were really hurt. And then I really spent some time and listened, and I said, what I'm hearing is actually not that I'm doing a bad job, but they're saying the same level of energy and leadership and vision needed to be had throughout the city, because it's not just South Stockton that has issues. So I said, maybe I'm supposed to run for mayor. And then people were like, are you sure yet? Like, maybe one day, but are you sure? And I was like, well, we have 4 years of a body of work. We know the issues as well as we can. We don't have a lot of age, but we have government experience. We spent 4 years, and a lot of people were worried because in Stockton, especially, the narrative around young black men in particular is not one of being like a mayor or a governor. It's one of being like a criminal and being the problem, being the people we see on the news every day that are messing up our great city. In 150 plus years, the city had never had a black mayor, and there's like a reason for that. So a lot of people were worried that at 25, I think is when I announced I would run, that the timing was just a little bit off, and maybe 4 more years on city council would do the trick. But I said, well, we'll see. And we worked incredibly hard and ran and won, and we've been mayor for 18 months now.
Quite a story, right? All right, so let's talk about Stockton, and let's talk about your vision. And when we were in the White House, the way we envisioned criminal justice reform was larger than just those words, because what our goal was to think, what can we do to keep people out of the system to begin with? That's the beginning of it, is to be just and fair and give every young kid a fair chance. What can we do to reform the existing system? And that's everything from bail reform to sentencing reform to diversion programs, et cetera. And then when people are incarcerated, how do we prepare them for reentry and ensure that the sentence actually is tailored to the crime and the unique circumstances, moving away from these mandatory minimum sentences, which are atrocious. And then when they're released, how do we make a smooth reentry so that the revolving door doesn't happen? So that's kind of how we always thought of it. And if you look at it that way, it should touch everybody's life to give everyone that fair shot. But you are about reinventing Stockton. So tell us a bit about what that means and how it fits in the context of criminal justice reform as I defined it.
Yeah, well, I think it's absolutely spot on. And for me, Dr. Paul Farmer, he talks about this idea of structural violence and how the way different systems interact make it so that violence is an outcome, that it shouldn't be a surprise that we get the outcomes we get given the inputs and the structures we have around them. So really when we talk about reinventing Stockton, we're talking about how do we make sure that all the systems that we've created as citizens in creating government, how do we make sure all those systems are working in a way that do no harm and actually help, especially the most vulnerable? And the difficulty of doing that as mayor is that in California, the mayor, the only social service I have authority over are cops. And for so long, our investment policy, not just in Stockton, but everywhere else, has been, let's make cops the answer to poverty, let's make them the answer to education, let's make them the answer to jobs, let's make them the answer to mental health and trauma. It's like, let's just send more officers, more officers, more officers. And what's interesting in Stockton is that our officers are like doing some of those functions now. And I keep saying, like, I want you to do law enforcement. Like, let's find some social workers to do the social work and some therapists to do the therapists. But I'm glad you see the need for that to be part of your toolkit as well. So, and then I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but basically when we say reinvent Stockton, we just want to change the conversation from one that's looking at an outcome as if this outcome is peculiar to one that understands that unless we change the way we educate our kids, when only 17% of all adults in this city have a BA or higher, when 23% of families live in poverty, when the area median income is $46,000, when we've been double the state average for about 30 years on average in shootings and homicides, and when 92% of those have been young men of color, when the city's only 11% African American, so maybe 4 to 5% African American males, but they've made up 40% of all homicides and shooting victims in the last 20 years. We have to change all of that, and it's not going to happen overnight. But it happens with really focused deterrence through our ceasefire program and understanding that in building relationships, there's an opportunity.
Tell us about the ceasefire, because obviously everybody tailors it. What's unique about yours, or what is it that you think is effective, I guess?
Yeah, I think what's unique about ours, it's probably just the cast of players. I think the strategy is really the same in that we identify the men. And I think it's also a larger meta conversation about this like kind of cultural violence and toxic masculinity, because it's all 92% are men. Men. So we sit down with them, myself, police chief, U.S. attorney, pastors, social service providers, and the message is, hey, violence is top priority. The violence has to stop. Cops, law enforcement aren't going anywhere, and in fact, they're more focused on this than ever. But on the flip side, what we want to do differently is give you as much attention from the social service world as you get from law enforcement. We know you interact with law enforcement a lot, so how do we get you to interact with our mental health professionals, with our job training programs, and then the flip side is talking to our programs about how do we make sure if they go to job training, they get a job, because the only thing worse than no hope is false hope in terms of trying to change, and change is hard, especially if you've been mired in a life, and just because you come to one of our call-ins doesn't mean you've moved, or all your friends have changed, or the material circumstances of your life have changed. So it's understanding that what we're asking you to do is hard, and we understand that it's hard, but we're committed to walking with you. So that's our ceasefire program.
Well, let me ask you this, because it brought to mind another question, which is obviously you need the business community's buy-in, and jobs are in the business community. And so in that context, not just about ceasefire, but more generally, how have you managed to engage your business community so that they feel like they are invested in the solutions and a part of those solutions?
Well, so in January of this year, so in addition to ceasefire, we're also running the Advanced Peace Program, which is focused on a smaller number of guys, of just the 25 guys identified through community research and police algorithm statistics that we know are currently actively bearing firearms and likely to be shooters or be shot, and giving them intensive 7 days a week case management, travel opportunities after 6 months, stipend, et cetera. And it was a little bit controversial because of the stipend part, but the business community wrote letters of support. And it came from just sitting with them and having a conversation around, look, you guys, we're a city of 320,000 people, and what's hurting your business oftentimes is our image. And our image is rooted in the reality where less than 1% of our population drives 80% of our violent crime rate. So whether you like these guys or not, they impact your bottom line, because when people are reading articles about the shootings in Stockton and the violence in Stockton, they're not talking about me and you. They're not talking about 99.9% of the people. It's how will we let 200 people shape the perception of our whole city? And what do you have any skin in the game? Like the police chief's working overtime, I'm doing my best, but how can you help? And they've been really energized and motivated. And before that, in 2013, after we exited bankruptcy, we went to the business community and the community writ large and say, well, hey, we have to raise taxes to really create an Office of Violence Prevention that's focused on preventing and reducing violence. And also to add some more officers, because at one point we had the lowest officers per capita of any city in the nation. And they stepped up and said yes and ran the campaign and signed on. So we've been really blessed to have the support of our business community to really think about sort of how do we make it so we actually make reductions, and how is that rooted in evidence, even if it doesn't confirm our own biases or our own assumptions. And I've been really blessed to have a business community that gets that. I think it's because everyone's just tired. Like, we've been dealing with this for 30 years. Like, clearly what we were doing in the past hasn't worked as well as we wanted to, so let's try something new.
They're hungry for change, too. All right, so I know a little something about change and a little something about hope, but when you finish your last, it's getting ready to go dark here for a second, though, because when you finish your last term, one of the challenges, of course, is that when you turn the gavel over, you want to make sure that what you've done is sustainable. And so, obviously, it would be apparent to anybody that a lot of what President Obama did when he was in office is there have been attempts to unwind it. What strategies are you thinking through now to ensure that whoever succeeds you, it will be harder to reverse? And I think one obvious one is getting buy-in from the business community, because hopefully they'll hold the next person accountable. But what else are you thinking about so that your hard work doesn't get reversed?
I think we spend a lot of times engaging the community-based organizations as well as the business community, because especially in local government, terms come and go, politicians come and go, but the community-based organizations, they're going to be there. So I've been bringing them along every step of the way and having them lead it and not actually seeding some things in them versus in government. So even if the next person is like the next person we have on Pennsylvania Avenue, that they have enough capacity to withstand and resist. And I think the other part is also institutionalizing it as much as possible. But speaking about it so it becomes just part of the lexicon. So it becomes part of just the conversation we have as a community. And I'm not sure, but also just making sure, I think it's easier to support a successor in a city that's only 300,000 people. So I'm fairly confident that we'll make sure that we have all the folks in line to support folks who are going to continue the vision, but also understand the vision is led by me, but it's really rooted in what the community wants to see for itself in terms of being a community of opportunity, a community of fairness, a community that embraces diversity and equity, and a community of second chances. So I guess to answer your question, spending as much time as possible just seeding things in the community, and also putting things on the books where appropriate.
So, Mr. Mayor, you are an inspiration to me. You know that. I've told you that 1,000 times. I'm so proud of you, and I get to say it because I knew you back when, so it's not intended to be anything other than out of love and admiration for everything you've done. in the time we have left, and I'm sorry to see that clock going down, because we did want to have some questions from the audience, which we're not going to have time to do, but leadership is an important skill that you clearly have. You've mastered it at a very young age. What advice would you have to the people in the audience who are in their communities trying mightily to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice and coming up against all kinds of resistance, and whether it's at the federal level, and I was actually delighted to hear Mark Holden say he's optimistic. I'm not sure I share that optimism about a bill that we would all support getting passed, but he does have stick-to-itness, and that's a good quality. But what would you say to the folks in the room and those who are watching about leadership and how to get up in the morning when some days it's really hard?
Well, I think number one, especially as a black person, I realized that for the past 400 years, folks had to get up in much more dire circumstances. I think of I think of folks like, I was really spending time thinking about Harriet Tubman because I was watching Underground with my wife. It's a great show if you haven't seen it. So we're watching the Harriet Tubman episode, and I'm like, wow, she was like the #1 most wanted person in this country. She was like Osama bin Laden in like 1800s, and she didn't go to school. She was also a woman and black in 1800s America, with no Siri, no MapQuest,
Did she find the North?
and then go back and bring others with her. And I'm like, that's tired. I'm like, okay, if she could do that,
exactly,
I could get up and go to this council meeting. And then one of my other mentors is Mary Wright Elderman. And we had a conversation after Tamir Rice incident, and I was feeling really down. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you not understand that it's a privilege to struggle for justice?" And I said, "Huh?" She said, "It's a privilege." And she talked about how she started with the sit-ins at Spelman, and then started to see Head Start and bringing Attorney General Kennedy to see the poverty. And she talks about how over the past 50 years there have been so many gains and so many losses, but she said, "I feel proud to stand in the lineage of folks who have struggled and pushed the ball forward." And then I think the last thing for me is just understanding that the only thing that's guaranteed is that if we don't do nothing, nothing changes. There's no guarantee that everything we do will work.
That's for sure.
But the only guarantee is if we do nothing, nothing changes. And I think for me now, I have a little bit of degrees. I have a little bit of a platform. If I quit, I'll be all right, right? Like me and my family will still have our bills taken care of and eat, but there's so many people I represent who a choice of apathy or a choice of nihilism is like a choice of or fatalism is like a choice of almost death, or at least economic death. And for me, it's like, well, if these folks could get up every day and pick fruits for everyone and drive Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and still raise kids, and again, I could get up and go to this council meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Tubbs.
Wow, what a way to close out the morning. We're going to be back here at 1:45 for the sentence. Lunch is served at where we were for most of the day yesterday in the student dining on the second floor. For those of you who are attending the Mayors for Smart on Crime meeting, it will be on the 9th floor. That's for those who received the invitation for that. And the meeting led by Draper Richards Kaplan will be in the 6th floor moot courtroom. So we'll see you back here at 1:45 for the sentence.